In the New York underworld, Lyra Di Sano's heart was the most erratic thing, both literally and figuratively. Standing before the mirror in a radiant silk gown for her 21st birthday, Lyra looked like a glass rose, magnificent yet pitifully fragile. But few knew that the trembling beat in her chest wasn't just due to her congenital heart condition. It was because of the man standing on the other side of the door, Enzio Valerius. Lyra's love for him was a secret, stained with despair. It began 11 years ago, when the rough hands of a teenage Enzio pulled her from the pitch-black waters of the Atlantic. He hadn't saved her with tenderness. He had saved her with the ruthlessness of a dark savior. Since then, Enzio had become her oxygen, her only faith. But loving Enzio was like loving a storm. He was the tyrant who dictated crowns, while she was merely a debt, a piece of collateral in a blood contract between two families. She craved to be seen by him as a woman rather than a fragile vase to be kept in a glass cage. "He will never love me," Lyra whispered to herself, pressing her palm against the cold glass of the mirror. "To Enzio, I am just an investment that needs to be preserved." And yet, a dark part of her screamed, if the price of being touched by him was becoming his prisoner, she would willingly step into that cage forever. The sound of tires screeched on the gravel below the hall. Enzio had arrived, not to celebrate a birthday, but to collect the debt that was her very life. Lyra took a deep breath, feeling her heart skip a beat. This time because of the suffocating possessiveness of the man named Enzio Valerius. The air in the Disano estate was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of unspoken treachery. It was Lyra Di Sano's 21st birthday, a night that was supposed to be a coronation of a princess, but felt more like the sharpening of a guillotine. Lyra stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her suite, her fingers trembling as they smoothed the silk of her champagne-colored gown. She was the Starlight Rose of New York, a fragile beauty whose heartbeat was a ticking clock. Since the fever that had scarred her heart valves as a child, her life had been measured in dosages and hushed conversations. "You look pale, stepdaughter," a voice like chilled vodka drifted from the doorway. Lyra didn't need to turn to see Lyra Di Sano. Her stepmother stood there, draped in black lace that clung to her like a second skin. Valia was the Black Widow, a woman who had buried Lyra's mother under a veil of whispers and eventually claimed the Di Sano throne. "The doctor said excitement is bad for me, Valia. You of all people should know that," Lyra replied, her voice soft but laced with a quiet fire. Valia stepped forward, her red lips curving into a predatory smile. "Excitement is inevitable tonight. Your father, Lorenzo, has made a decision. The Disano Empire is bleeding, and you are the only bandage left." Lyra's heart gave a painful thud. "What do you mean?" "The debt to the Valerius family. It's time to pay, Lyra. Enzio is coming tonight, not to celebrate your birth, but to claim his property." The name Enzio Valerius sent a shiver down Lyra's spine. He was the Tyrant, a man whose lineage traced back to Roman emperors and Sicilian warlords. He didn't just run the ports of New York. He owned the very air the city breathed. To the world, he was a ghost in a three-piece suit. To Lyra, he was the shadow that had haunted her dreams for 11 years. 11 years ago, a terrified 10-year-old Lyra had been tossed into the freezing waters of the Atlantic by her father's enemies. She remembered the blackness, the crushing weight of the sea. And then, him. A teenage boy with eyes like storm clouds had dived in, dragging her back to the surface. He had saved her life, only to disappear into the underworld. Now, that boy was a king, and he was coming to collect. The gala was a sea of masks and hidden agendas. In the center of the ballroom, Lorenzo Di Sano stood tall, though his eyes lacked their usual luster. The empire was crumbling under the weight of a war with the Russian syndicates, and Lorenzo had been forced to kneel to the only man who could stop the slaughter, Enzio Valerius. Suddenly, the music died. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. A man walked in, and the room seemed to lose its oxygen. Enzio Valerius did not walk. He invaded. Standing at 6'3", his presence was a physical weight. His suit was the color of midnight, tailored so precisely it looked like armor. His hair was dark, swept back from a face that was a masterpiece of cold, aristocratic cruelty. Behind him followed Cassian, his right hand, a silent shadow with a scarred jaw and eyes that scanned the room for threats before Enzio even took a step. Enzio's gaze didn't linger on the diamond chandeliers or the fawning senators. His eyes locked onto Lyra, standing at the top of the grand staircase. For a moment, the mask of the tyrant slipped, revealing a hunger so primal it made Lyra's breath hitch. He approached Lorenzo, but his eyes never left Lyra. "Valerius," Lorenzo greeted, his voice strained. "You're late." "I am exactly when I intend to be, Lorenzo," Enzio replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated in Lyra's chest. He turned his head slightly, his silver-grey eyes pinning Lyra to the spot. "The rose looks delicate tonight. Are you sure she can survive the wind?" "She is a Disano," Lorenzo said defensively. "She is stronger than she looks." Enzio stepped closer to the stairs, reaching out a hand toward Lyra. His knuckles were dusted with faint scars, the marks of a man who did his own killing. "Come down, Lyra. Let the world see what I've bought." The tension snapped not with a word, but with a roar. The skylights above the ballroom shattered in a rain of glass. Masked men, Valia's secret Russian allies, descended on ropes, submachine guns spitting fire into the crowd. Screams erupted. The polished marble floor was instantly painted in crimson. Lorenzo fell first, a bullet catching him in the shoulder as he tried to reach his daughter. "Father!" Lyra screamed, her heart racing so fast it felt like it would burst. She collapsed to her knees, the air leaving her lungs. Through the chaos, she saw Enzio move. He was a blur of lethal grace. He didn't seek cover. He became the danger. With a beretta in each hand, he moved through the ballroom like a scythe through wheat. Cassian was at his back, a silent whirlwind of blades and bullets. Enzio reached the stairs in seconds. He fired a final shot into the head of a gunman before holstering his weapon and scooping Lyra into his arms. "Stay with me, Lyra," he commanded, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. "My father," she gasped, clutching his lapels. Her hands were stained with blood, not hers, but the world's. "Cassian has him. He's alive," Enzio lied, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He looked down at her, his face splattered with red, his eyes burning with a terrifying possessiveness. "The Disano estate is dead, Lyra. From this moment on, you belong to the House of Valerius." He carried her out of the burning mansion as the sirens wailed in the distance. He didn't look back at the ruin of her life. He only looked at her, his starlight rose, finally back in his arms after 11 years of waiting in the dark. As he tossed her into the back of his armored SUV, Lyra felt the first pang of her heart failing. The world turned grey. "Don't you dare die on me," Enzio growled, his hand pressing firmly against her heart, as if he could command it to beat by sheer will alone. "I didn't wait a decade to watch you fade." The SUV roared to life, leaving behind the ashes of her past. The tyrant had his queen, and New York was about to learn the price of his obsession. The transition from the chaos of the Disano estate to the stillness of the Valerius fortress was a blur of shadows and the rhythmic thrumming of a high-performance engine. When the darkness finally peeled away from Lyra's vision, she did not find herself in the sterile white of a hospital room. Instead, she was submerged in an atmosphere of suffocating luxury. Lyra blinked, her eyelashes heavy. The ceiling above her was a masterpiece of dark mahogany beams and intricate gold leaf, illuminated by the flickering amber glow of a fireplace. The air smelled of expensive cedar wood, old books, and a faint, sharp undertone of antiseptic. She tried to sit up, but a sharp, localized ache in her chest forced a gasp from her lips. Her hand flew to her sternum, feeling the frantic, uneven fluttering of her heart, a bird trapped in a cage of bone. Don't move. The sedative is still in your system, and your heart rate hasn't stabilized. The voice was a low vibration that seemed to come from the shadows in the corner of the room. Lyra turned her head slowly. Enzio Valerius sat in a high-backed leather chair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was still wearing the trousers and waistcoat of his tuxedo, but his jacket was gone, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the throat. His knuckles were bruised, and a faint smear of dried blood remained on his jawline. He looked less like a businessman and more like a king resting after a conquest. Where am I? Lyra's voice was a mere shadow of itself, cracked and dry. You are at the Valerius Heights, Enzio replied, standing up. He moved with a predatory silence that made Lyra's pulse spike despite her weakness. He approached the bed, the moonlight catching the silver grey of his eyes. My private estate. It is the only place in New York where Isabella's reach cannot find you. My father, Lyra whispered, the memory of the ballroom bloodbath rushing back, the shattering glass, the screams, Lorenzo falling. Is he? Enzio reached the bedside. He set his glass down on the nightstand and reached for a medical chart Lyra hadn't noticed. Lorenzo is alive. Cassian took him to a private clinic under my protection. He is in a medically induced coma. The bullet missed his heart, but his age and the shock have made his recovery uncertain. Lyra felt a wave of relief so cold it made her shiver. Alive. He was alive. But as she looked at Enzio, she realized the price of that survival. Why did you bring me here? Why not a hospital? Enzio leaned over her, his hands bracing on the mattress on either side of her body. He trapped her in the small space between his arms, his scent, dark, spicy, and overwhelmingly masculine, filling her senses. Because a hospital is a public place, Lyra, and you are no longer a public person, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly silk. The moment the news of the massacre hits the morning papers, the Disano assets will be frozen. Your stepmother, Valia, has already fled to the Russian consulate, claiming you were the one who orchestrated the hit to take over the family business. There is a warrant out for your questioning. Lyra's eyes widened. That's a lie. She was the one. She called them. I saw her smiling. I know, Enzio said, his thumb reaching out to brush a stray hair from her forehead. His touch was surprisingly cool, yet it felt like it burned her skin. But the law follows the money, and currently the money is following the Black Widow. You are a fugitive, Lyra. To the world you are a criminal. To me, you are a liability I've decided to keep. Keep. Lyra's breath hitched. I am not a dog, Enzio. I am a human being. You are a Disano, he corrected, his eyes narrowing. And according to the contract your father signed 11 years ago, the night I dragged your shivering, half-dead body out of the Atlantic, you belong to the House of Valerius the moment the Disano line falters. The line has faltered. You are mine. He reached for her hand and Lyra flinched, but he was faster. He didn't grab her. Instead, he slid something onto her ring finger. It was a band of white gold, set with a diamond as black as a raven's wing. "What is this?" she demanded, trying to pull her hand away. "Your protection," Enzio stated. "We are getting married this afternoon. By tonight, you will be a Valerius. My name is a shield that even the United States government hesitates to strike. As my wife, you are untouchable. As Lyra Di Sano, you are a corpse waiting to happen." "This isn't a marriage," Lyra spat, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. "This is a kidnapping." Enzio stood up to his full height, looking down at her with a terrifying lack of emotion. "Call it what you wish. But remember this, Starlight. I didn't spend a decade building an empire just to let you be slaughtered by a Russian whore. You will wear my ring, you will stay in this house, and you will do exactly as I say, or I will withdraw my men from your father's clinic. Do I make myself clear?" Lyra's heart gave a jagged thud. The threat was a blade to her throat. He knew she would do anything for Lorenzo. She looked at the black diamond on her finger, its dark facets reflecting the dying fire. "I hate you," she whispered. "I've been hated by better people than you, Lyra," Enzio replied coldly. He turned toward the door. "Cassian will be outside. A maid will bring you something to eat. Eat it all. You look like a ghost, and I find ghosts unappealing." The door closed with a heavy, final click. Lyra collapsed back into the pillows, her chest aching. She was in a gilded cage, and the man who had saved her life 11 years ago had just become her jailer. An hour later, the oak door opened again. A young woman in a quiet grey uniform entered with a silver tray. Behind her stood Cassian. The consigliere was a mountain of a man, his face a roadmap of scars that told stories of wars Lyra couldn't imagine. He didn't speak. He simply stood by the window, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his eyes fixed on the rolling hills of the estate outside. "My name is Maria, miss," the maid said softly, setting the tray on a table. "Mr. Valerius has ordered a specific diet for your heart condition. Please, you must try to eat." Lyra ignored the food. She looked at Cassian. "How long has he been planning this?" Cassian didn't turn around. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. "Enzio doesn't plan, miss. He prepares. He has been prepared for this night since the day he turned 18. "To trap me?" Lyra asked bitterly. Cassian finally turned. His eyes were not cold like Enzio's. They were weary. "To save you. You see a cage, Lyra. Enzio sees a fortress. There are 3 separate syndicates and 5 different government agencies that want you dead or in a cell today. This house is the only square inch of earth where you are safe." "Safe," Lyra mocked. "While he uses my father's coma as leverage? While he forces me into a marriage?" "Enzio Valerius does not do anything without a reason," Cassian said, moving toward the door. "Eat your breakfast. The priest will be here at 3. 3 o'clock came with the grim inevitability of a funeral. Lyra was dressed in a simple, high-collared white lace dress that felt like a shroud. She was led down a long, echoing hallway into a private chapel within the estate. The walls were lined with ancient icons, their golden eyes watching her with silent judgment. Enzio was waiting at the altar. He had changed into a fresh black suit. He looked impeccable, his dark hair combed back, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood a priest who looked far too frightened to be officiating a wedding. The ceremony was short, stripped of music, flowers, or joy. It was a legal transaction conducted in the presence of God. "Do you, Enzio Valerius, take Lyra Di Sano?" "I do," Enzio said, his voice ringing through the chapel with a terrifying certainty. When it was Lyra's turn, her voice failed her. She looked at the priest, then at the flickering candles, then finally at Enzio. He was watching her, his silver eyes boring into hers, demanding her submission. She thought of her father lying in a bed miles away, his life hanging by a thread that Enzio held. I do, she whispered. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. The priest didn't tell them to kiss. Perhaps even he could feel the coldness emanating from the couple. Enzio stepped forward, his hand gripping Lyra's elbow. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "Congratulations, Mrs. Valerius," he murmured. "You've just traded a death sentence for a life of luxury. Try to look a little more grateful." He pulled her away from the altar, leading her out of the chapel and back toward the main house. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the marble floors. As they reached the grand foyer, Enzio stopped. He turned her to face him, his hands sliding up to cup her jaw. For a second, Lyra thought he might actually kiss her, but his eyes were fixed on the scar on her neck, a faint line from the surgery she'd had as a child. "You are pale again," he noted, his brow furrowing. "It's a wedding," Lyra said, her voice trembling. "I'm allowed to feel faint." "Not in my house," Enzio said. He looked over her shoulder at Cassian, who was waiting by the door. "Is the medical team ready?" "They are in the West Wing, boss," Cassian replied. Enzio looked back at Lyra. "You are going to have a full cardiovascular workup. Every beat of your heart will be monitored. Every breath you take will be recorded. You wanted to know why I married you, Lyra? It's because I don't like losing my investments. And you are the most expensive thing I've ever bought." He let go of her, his expression returning to its mask of stone. "Go with Cassian. I have business to attend to. There is a war starting, and I need to make sure the Disano name is buried properly so that the Valerius name can rise." Lyra watched him walk away, his footsteps echoing through the house. She looked down at the black diamond on her finger. She was a wife, a fugitive, and a prisoner. But as she followed Cassian toward the medical wing, she felt a flicker of the old fire in her chest. Enzio thought he had bought a rose to keep in a vase. He didn't realize that even the most fragile roses had thorns. And she would wait. She would watch. And when the time was right, she would make the Tyrant bleed. The west wing of the Valerius estate was less of a home and more of a sanctuary for the morbidly wealthy. It was a wing designed for survival, sleek, soundproofed, and equipped with medical technology that rivaled the city's top trauma centers. For Lyra, it was a reminder that her body was a liability, a fragile vessel that required constant calibration. For 3 days, Enzio had been a shadow. He didn't visit her during the grueling tests. He didn't share a meal. Instead, he communicated through Cassian and a team of silent, efficient doctors who spoke in hushed tones about ventricular efficiency and mitral regurgitation. Lyra sat on the edge of the examination table, her skin pale against the dark grey silk robe she had been given. The lead cardiologist, a man named Dr. Aris, clicked off a monitor showing a sonogram of her heart. "You're stable, Mrs. Valerius," Aris said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The stress of the gala caused some minor arrhythmia, but the medication Enzio, Mr. Valerius, has provided is working. Your heart is a delicate clock. We just need to keep it wound." "The medication he provided?" Lyra asked, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't my usual prescription." Aris hesitated, a flicker of something, fear perhaps, crossing his face. "It's a proprietary compound developed by Valerius Pharmaceuticals. It's far more advanced than anything on the commercial market." "Valerius Pharmaceuticals," Lyra whispered. She knew Enzio ran shipping, construction, and the dark underbelly of the city's docks, but she hadn't realized his reach extended into the very chemistry keeping her alive. It was another layer of the cage, He didn't just own the roof over her head, he owned the blood in her veins. When Aris left, Lyra didn't return to her room. Instead, she waited until the hallway was quiet, the heavy tread of Cassian's boots fading as he went to the lower levels. She needed to know what she had married. She needed to know why a man like Enzio Valerius had spent 11 years obsessed with a girl who had no empire left to give him. The estate was a labyrinth of stone and secrets. Lyra moved like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. She avoided the main foyer where the guards stood and slipped into the library, a 2-story cavern of leather-bound books and shadows. At the far end of the library was a heavy steel door. It lacked a handle, possessing only a biometric scanner. Lyra stared at it. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and pressed her hand against the glass. Access denied. A cold chill ran down her spine. Of course. But as she turned to leave, her foot caught on a loose piece of the rug. Beneath it, she saw a faint indentation, a manual override. It was a relic of the old house before Enzio had modernized it. She knelt, prying the small metal plate open. It was a simple keypad. She thought of dates, her father's birthday, the date of the Valerius founding. Then a sudden impulse hit her. She punched in the date she had nearly drowned. The 6th of November, 2015. With a hiss of hydraulic pressure, the steel door clicked open. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs, a dangerous, frantic rhythm. She stepped inside. The room was dark, cooled to a precise temperature. Servers hummed in the corner, their blue lights blinking like eyes. In the center of the room was a mahogany desk, and on it sat a single, thick, physical file. The label on the file made her blood turn to ice. Subject: the Disano debt. Collateral asset L-01. She opened the folder. Inside were photographs, not of boardrooms or ledgers, but of her. There was a photo of her at 14, sitting in a park. At 16, entering a hospital for her second surgery. At 18, at her debutante ball. Every milestone of her life had been captured from a distance. But it wasn't the surveillance that terrified her. It was the documents behind the photos. She pulled out a yellowed piece of parchment, signed by her father and Enzio's father, the late Silas Valerius. In exchange for the stabilization of the Disano ports and the elimination of the Russian threat, Lorenzo Disano agrees to the blood bond. Should the Disano line fail to produce a male heir or fall into insolvency, the daughter, Lyra, shall be delivered to the Valerius house. She is the debt. She is the payment. Lyra gasped, the paper fluttering from her hands. 11 Nurm. 11 years she had lived a lie, thinking she was a princess of a proud house, when in reality she was a promissory note. Enzio hadn't saved her out of heroism. He had saved her because she was his property. He had been protecting his investment since she was a child. Searching for answers in the dark is a dangerous habit, Lyra. The voice came from the doorway, cold and sharp as a razor. Lyra spun around. Enzio stood there, framed by the blue light of the servers. He looked monstrous in the shadows, his height filling the narrow room. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was infinitely worse. "You bought me," she whispered, her voice shaking. 11 years ago. My father sold me to your family like a piece of livestock. Enzio stepped into the room, the door sliding shut behind him with a final, echoing thud. He approached her slowly, picking up the fallen parchment. He glanced at it, then back at her. Your father was a desperate man, Lyra. He had lost his wife, his fleet was burning, and the Russians were at his throat. My father was a shark. He didn't give loans, he took souls. Enzio's eyes searched her, silver and unyielding. But my father is dead, and I am the one who decided to enforce the contract. Why? Lyra cried, stepping back until her spine hit the cold server racks. You have everything. You have more money than God, more power than the mayor. Why did you want a broken girl with a failing heart? Enzio was suddenly there, his hand slamming against the rack beside her head, pinning her. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The smell of cedar and cold rain enveloped her. Because the moment I pulled you out of that water, I felt your heart stop, he growled, his voice low and raw. I felt the life leave you under my palms, and I decided then that I wouldn't let the shadows have you. You aren't just a debt, Lyra. You are the only thing in this world I've ever had to fight to keep alive. Everything else, the money, the blood, the empire, that was easy. Keeping you breathing, that was the challenge. You don't love me, Lyra choked out, tears blurring her vision. You're obsessed with a trophy you rescued. Love is a weakness I cannot afford, Enzio said, his hand moving from the rack to her throat, his thumb tracing the pulse that fluttered there. But obsession is permanent. You belong to me, Lyra Valerius. Not because of a piece of paper, but because I am the only man in this world willing to kill everyone in it to keep your heart beating. He pulled her away from the wall, his grip firm but not bruising. He led her out of the vault and back into the library, where the moonlight bled through the high windows. Valia has moved, he said, his tones suddenly shifting to the clinical coldness of a warlord. She seized the Disano shipping manifests. She's trying to sell your family's loyalty to the Volkov syndicate. If she succeeds, New York will become a graveyard. Lyra wiped her eyes, the shock of the vault beginning to settle into a cold, hard anger. What does that have to do with me? I'm just collateral, remember? Enzio stopped and turned to her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, ornate key. He pressed it into her palm. There is a gala tomorrow night at the Pierre Hotel. The city's elite will be there, so will Valia. She thinks you are dead or hidden away in a cellar. I'm going to show her that she was wrong. He leaned down, his lips brushing her forehead, a gesture that felt like both a blessing and a threat. You are going to walk into that room as the head of Valerius Pharmaceuticals. You are going to reclaim your father's legacy, and you are going to do it by my side. And if I refuse? Enzio's gaze darkened. Then Valia wins, and I promise you, Lyra, she won't be as careful with your heart as I am. The next morning, the cage felt different. Lyra didn't stay in bed. She went to the vanity and looked at herself. The starlight rose looked different. There was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before the gala. Maria entered with a dress bag. Inside was a gown the colour of a bruised plum, deep purple silk that looked like liquid shadow. Along with it was a necklace of black pearls, each one perfectly round and cold to the touch. Mr. Valerius asked me to tell you that the car leaves at 7, Maria said quietly. Lyra touched the black pearls. She remembered the vault. She remembered the contract. She was a debt, a piece of property, a girl whose life was a series of managed crises. But Enzio had said one thing that stayed with her. He had to fight to keep her alive. If she was his most expensive investment, then she had power. She dressed with a precision that felt like sharpening a blade. She applied her makeup to emphasize the sharp angles of her face, the paleness of her skin making the deep plum of her lips stand out like a wound. When she stepped into the foyer, Cassian was waiting. He looked her up and down, a ghost of a smile touching his scarred mouth. "The boss is waiting in the car, Mrs. Valerius," he said. "Tell the boss I'll be there when I'm ready," Lyra replied, her voice steady. She walked past him, her silk heels clicking against the marble. She didn't head for the car. Instead, she went to the library. She punched in the code again. June 11th, 2015. The door hissed open. She stepped inside, went to the desk, and took a small, silver thumb drive she had noticed hidden in the back of the file the night before. She didn't know what was on it, but if Enzio kept it in his most private vault, it was leverage. She tucked the drive into the concealed pocket of her gown and walked out. Enzio was waiting in the back of the armoured Maybach. He watched her approach, his eyes tracking the movement of the silk over her hips. When she slid in beside him, the atmosphere in the car became electric, thick with a tension that was no longer just about fear. "You kept me waiting," Enzio noted, his voice a low rumble. "I'm an investment, Enzio," Lyra said, looking him straight in the eye. "And the best investments require patience." For the first time, Enzio didn't look away. He didn't bark a command. He reached out, his hand covering hers, his thumb tracing the black diamond on her finger. "Tonight, Lyra, you aren't a rose," he whispered as the car began to move toward the city. "Tonight, you are the storm." As the city lights began to blur past the window, Lyra felt the thumb drive pressing against her thigh. She was a prisoner in his world, yes, but the Tyrant had forgotten one thing. When you bring a ghost back to life, you don't get to choose what she remembers. The war for New York was about to begin, and Lyra Di Sano was no longer a pawn. She was the hand that held the knife. The Pierre Hotel rose above Fifth Avenue like a monument to old-world opulence, its limestone facade glowing under the amber hum of the city's streetlights. Tonight, it was the epicenter of New York's high society, a gathering of the city's most powerful elite, masked in silk and sequins to celebrate the rebirth of the pharmaceutical industry. But beneath the clinking of crystal and the soft swell of the orchestra, a predatory tension hummed. The black Maybach glided to the curb like a shark entering a lagoon. Enzio sat in the shadows of the back seat, his profile a study in granite and cold intent. Beside him, Lyra felt the weight of the silver thumb drive hidden in the folds of her plum-coloured gown. It was a cold, hard secret pressing against her skin, a reminder that she was no longer just the Starlight Rose. She was a player in a game where the stakes were measured in blood. "Remember," Enzio said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to fill the small space of the car. "You do not leave my side. You do not speak to the press. And if Valia approaches you, you look through her as if she were a ghost." Lyra turned to him, her eyes bright with a defiance that hadn't been there 48 hours ago. "I'm not a child, Enzio, and I'm certainly not a ghost. If you wanted a doll to carry on your arm, you should have married a mannequin." Enzio's eyes narrowed, the silver in them flashing like a blade. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the delicate line behind her ear. The touch was possessive, a silent claim. "I didn't marry a doll, Lyra. I married a Disano. I expect you to act like one." The valet opened the door and the roar of the city flooded in. Enzio stepped out first, offering his hand. Lyra took it, her fingers curling around his. As they stepped onto the red carpet, the wall of photographers erupted. The flashes were blinding, a rhythmic explosion of white light that turned the world into a series of jagged, frozen moments. "Mr. Valerius, is it true? A secret marriage? Mrs. Valerius, how is your father? Is the Disano-Valerius merger a hostile takeover?" Enzio ignored them all, his grip on Lyra's hand ironclad as he led her up the steps. Inside, the ballroom was a masterpiece of gold leaf and velvet. Men in black tie and women in masked finery turned as they entered. The silence that followed them was more telling than any applause. They had been in the room for less than 20 minutes when the crowd parted like a dark sea. Lyra Di Sano appeared, draped in a gown of shimmering silver scales that made her look like a serpent. Her mask was a delicate web of black lace, but her eyes, sharp, calculating, and filled with a terrifying intellect, were unmistakable. She held a glass of champagne in one hand, her smile a masterpiece of practiced grief. "Enzio," Valia purred, her voice like silk over gravel. "I must admit, I didn't think you had it in you to be so romantic. A marriage in the middle of a tragedy. It's almost Shakespearean." Enzio's posture didn't change, but Lyra could feel the temperature around him drop. "Valia, I'm surprised the Russian consulate let you out of your cage so soon." Valia's laugh was a light, brittle sound. She turned her gaze to Lyra, her smile sharpening. "And Lyra, my darling girl, you look so healthy. I suppose the Valerius medicine is doing wonders for that poor, tired heart of yours." "It's doing better than yours, Valia," Lyra replied, her voice steady despite the frantic thudding in her chest. "At least mine still beats for my family. Yours only beats for the highest bidder." Valia's eyes flashed with a momentary rage before she smoothed it over. She stepped closer, leaning in as if to share a secret. The scent of her perfume, heavy, cloying jasmine, nauseated Lyra. "Be careful, Lyra," Valia whispered, her eyes darting to Enzio before returning to her stepdaughter. "You think he saved you? You think he's your protector? Ask him about the Starlight Project. Ask him what happened to the first 3 girls his father invested in before they found a heart that was a perfect match." Lyra's breath hitched. A perfect match? Before she could speak, Enzio's arm was around her waist, pulling her back with a force that was almost violent. "We're done here, Valia. If I see you within 10 feet of my wife again, I'll stop caring about the consulate's walls." Valia only smiled, a slow, toxic curve of her lips. She took a sip of her champagne and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving a trail of jasmine and doubt in her wake. "What was she talking about?" Lyra demanded as soon as they reached a secluded balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air hit her face, but it didn't soothe the fire in her blood. The Starlight Project? What did she mean? A perfect match. Enzio stood at the railing, his back to her. His shoulders were tense, his hands gripping the stone. "She's a liar, Lyra. She's trying to poison your mind so you'll run to her." "I'm not running to her," Lyra cried, crossing the balcony to stand beside him. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "But you kept a vault full of photos of me. You had a contract that called me collateral. If you're keeping me alive for a reason other than your investment, I need to know now." Enzio turned, his eyes dark with a storm of emotions she couldn't name. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached out, his fingers tracing the lace of her mask. He pulled it away, revealing her pale, trembling face. "My father was a monster, Lyra," he said, his voice raw. "He didn't just trade in ships and guns. He traded in human biology. He wanted to live forever, and he spent millions trying to find a way to engineer a heart that wouldn't fail. He called it the Starlight Project because he wanted something that would burn bright and never go out." Lyra's hand went to her chest, her fingers clutching the plum silk. "And I was one of the experiments?" "No," Enzio said, his voice cracking. "You were the one he couldn't touch, because I told him if he ever laid a hand on you, I'd burn the Valerius name to the ground. I've spent 11 years keeping you in a bubble, Lyra. Not because you were a debt to be collected, but because you were the only thing in this world that wasn't for sale." He stepped closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I married you to stop him. Even from the grave, my father's lawyers were trying to trigger the clause to take you to a facility in Switzerland. By marrying you, I legally became your primary guardian. I closed the project. Forever. Lyra wanted to believe him. She wanted to fall into his arms and let the tyrant protect her from the shadows. But the thumb drive in her pocket felt like a brand. Then why do you have a thumb drive labeled Starlight Final Phase in your vault? She asked, her voice a whisper. Enzio went perfectly still. He pulled back, his silver eyes searching hers. His hand moved to his pocket, then back to her. You went into the vault. I had to know, she said, her chin lifting. Lyra. Suddenly the balcony doors burst open. Cassian appeared, his face a mask of urgency. Boss, we have a problem. The Russian syndicates, they aren't just here to talk. They've breached the perimeter. Valia isn't here to bid. She's here to end it. The explosion was muted, a low thud from the floor below that made the crystal chandeliers in the ballroom dance. Then, the power died. The ballroom was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the moon and the flickering emergency lamps. Screams erupted as the masks of high society were torn away by pure, unadulterated panic. Get down, Enzio roared, shoving Lyra behind a heavy marble pillar just as the first spray of gunfire shattered the glass doors leading to the balcony. Bullets whined through the air, chipping away at the gold leaf and velvet. Cassian was already in motion, his own weapon barking in the dark. Enzio pulled a compact submachine gun from beneath his tuxedo jacket, a lethal elegance Lyra hadn't expected. Cassian, take the east stairs. Secure the exit, Enzio commanded. What about the girl? Cassian yelled over the din. She stays with me. Enzio grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her through the chaos toward the service elevators. They moved like shadows through the smoke, the smell of gunpowder and expensive perfume clashing in the air. Lyra's heart was a drum, a frantic, jagged rhythm that made her vision swim. Enzio, my chest! She gasped, stumbling. Enzio caught her before she hit the floor. He swept her into his arms, his eyes scanning the hallway. They reached the service elevator and he slammed the button. Stay with me, Lyra. Don't you dare stop now. The elevator doors opened, but they weren't empty. Two masked men in tactical gear stepped out, their rifles raised. Enzio didn't hesitate. He dropped Lyra to her feet and lunged, his body a blur of violence. He used his weapon as a club, swinging it into the first man's head while simultaneously kicking the second man back into the elevator. Lyra watched, frozen, as the man she had married turned into the monster the world feared. He was efficient. He was brutal. And in the flickering light of the elevator, he looked like the only thing standing between her and the grave. He finished the men in seconds. He grabbed Lyra again, pulling her into the elevator and slamming the button for the garage. The drive, Lyra, he panted, his white shirt stained with red. Give it to me. Lyra looked at him, her hand going to the pocket of her dress. She saw the blood on his jaw, the desperation in his eyes, and the shadow of the Starlight Project hanging over them both. If I give it to you, she whispered as the elevator began to descend, will you tell me the truth? All of it? Enzio leaned his head against the metal wall, a tired, ragged breath escaping him. The truth is, Lyra, I'm the villain in everyone's story but yours. And if you give me that drive, I can make sure your father wakes up in a world where Valia is nothing but a memory. The elevator doors opened to the garage. Enzio's SUV was waiting, the engine already humming. Lyra pulled the silver drive from her pocket. She looked at it, then at the man who had rescued her twice. She placed the drive in his hand. Fix it, she said, her voice hard. But if I find out you lied about the girls in Switzerland, Enzio, I'll be the one who ends the House of Valerius. Enzio didn't answer. He shoved the drive into his pocket and pushed her into the back of the SUV. As they roared out into the rainy New York night, Lyra looked back at the hotel. The pier was glowing with the blue and red lights of emergency vehicles. The masquerade was over. The war had begun, and the Starlight Rose was about to find out exactly how much blood it took to keep a heart beating in the city of ghosts. The roar of New York City was replaced by the haunting whistle of the Mediterranean wind. Lyra stood on the terrace of Villa Valerius, a fortress of sun-bleached stone perched precariously on a cliffside overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. Below, the water was a deep, bruised indigo, crashing against the jagged rocks with a violence that mirrored the turmoil in her chest. Behind her, the villa smelled of ancient dust, dried rosemary, and the cold metallic scent of the heavy security detail Enzio had stationed at every entrance. They had fled the burning gala at the pier, boarded a private jet in the dead of night, and crossed the Atlantic before the sun could rise over the wreckage of the Disano legacy. Enzio had barely spoken during the 12-hour flight. He had sat across from her, his eyes fixed on the silver thumb drive, as if he were trying to deconstruct its secrets through sheer force of will. Now, the Sicilian sun beat down on Lyra's shoulders, but she felt no warmth. She was wearing a simple white linen dress, a ghost in a house of shadows. "You haven't touched your tea." Enzio's voice was like the sea below, constant, deep, and dangerous. He stood in the arched doorway of the terrace, his dark hair ruffled by the salt air. He had traded his blood-stained tuxedo for a charcoal shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos of thorns and anchors that wrapped around his forearms. "I'm not hungry, Enzio. I'm tired of being moved like a chess piece," Lyra said, not turning around. "Why here? Why Sicily?" Enzio stepped onto the terrace, his presence immediately narrowing the world around her. He came to the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sea met the sky. "This is where the Valerius name was born, and it is the only place where the Volkovs and the Russians cannot follow. My family has held this coast for 400 years. Even the government knows better than to knock on these doors." "You mean it's a better cage?" she retorted, finally looking at him. Her heart gave a faint, jagged skip, and she instinctively pressed her hand to her chest. Enzio's eyes dropped to her hand. The clinical coldness returned to his expression. "Did you take your medication? The proprietary compound?" Lyra laughed, a brittle, dry sound. "The one developed by the project that used 3 other girls as trial runs?" "Yes, Enzio, I took it. I'd like to keep living, even if it's as your prisoner." Enzio's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He didn't hand it to her. He held it so she could see. It was an old, grainy image of a young boy, maybe 7 or 8, standing in front of this very villa. Beside him was a girl about the same age, her hair a wild mane of dark curls, her smile radiant. "Who is she?" Lyra whispered. "My sister. Bianca," Enzio said, his voice stripped of its usual iron. "She had the same condition you do, transposition of the great arteries. 11 years ago, my father didn't rescue you out of the goodness of his heart, Lyra. He rescued you because Bianca had died 6 months earlier, and he couldn't accept that his bloodline had a flaw he couldn't fix with money." Lyra felt the air leave her lungs. The Starlight Project wasn't just a quest for immortality. It was a father's madness, a grief-stricken monster trying to resurrect a ghost. "He wanted to use you as a vessel," Enzio continued, his gaze returning to the sea. "He spent years monitoring your heart, waiting for it to reach the exact stage of maturity where he could harvest the data, or more." "And you?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling. "Did you know this when you jumped into the ocean to save me?" Enzio finally looked at her. The silver in his eyes was clouded with a decade of secrets. I was 16. I heard him talking to the surgeons. I saw the blueprints for the facility in Switzerland. I didn't save you because of a contract, Lyra. I saved you because I saw my sister in you. I saw a life that shouldn't be traded for a ghost's peace. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek, but he stopped an inch away, as if afraid he might break her. But, as the years went by, you stopped being Bianca's shadow. You became Lyra. And I realized that the only way to protect you from my father's legacy was to own you myself. If you were mine, the project couldn't touch you. If you were mine, the lawyers couldn't trigger the harvest. So you became the monster to keep the bigger monster away, Lyra said, her heart aching with a strange, painful sympathy. I did what I had to, Enzio growled. And now that thumb drive, it contains the final encryption codes for the Valerius Pharmaceuticals vault. Valia wants it, because the data is worth billions to the black market. I want it so I can delete it. Every file, every blood test, every trace of the Starlight project. Later that afternoon, the villa fell into a heavy, humid silence. Enzio had retreated to the lower study with Cassian to coordinate their next move. Lyra, restless and feeling the walls of the villa closing in, slipped out into the lemon orchards that sloped down toward the cliffs. The scent of citrus was overwhelming, the bright yellow fruit hanging like ornaments against the deep green leaves. She walked until her breath grew short, her heart thumping a warning rhythm against her ribs. She sat on a low stone wall, looking back at the villa. It's a beautiful place to die, isn't it? Lyra jumped, her hand flying to her chest. A man was standing a few yards away, partially hidden by the shadow of a sprawling olive tree. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes that were a piercing, unnatural blue. He wasn't wearing the tactical gear of Enzio's men. He wore a simple linen suit, looking like a tourist who had lost his way. "Who are you?" Lyra demanded, her pulse racing. "How did you get past the guards?" "Guards are only as good as the men who pay them," the man said, stepping forward. He held up a hand, showing he was unarmed. "My name is Victor Volkov. I believe you've met my associates in New York." Lyra's blood turned to ice. Volkov, the Russian syndicate, the men who had turned her birthday into a slaughterhouse. "Stay back," she warned, reaching for the small, decorative knife she had hidden in the folds of her dress. A desperate precaution she'd taken before leaving the villa. Victor laughed, a soft, melodic sound. "I'm not here to kill you, Lyra. Why would I destroy the most valuable heart in Europe? I'm here to offer you a choice. Enzio Valerius tells you he's your protector, but he's just a different kind of jailer. He wants to delete the data? No, he wants to keep it for himself. He wants the power to decide who lives and who dies, just like his father did." "You're lying," Lyra spat. "Am I? Ask him about the final phase on that drive. Ask him why he hasn't deleted it yet. He's waiting, Lyra. He's waiting to see if your heart fails so he can use the project's last resort. A synthetic transplant that will make you dependent on him for the rest of your life. You won't be a wife. You'll be a machine owned by the House of Valerius." Victor took another step, his eyes fixed on the black diamond on her finger. "Come with me. My family doesn't want the data to control you. We want to sell it and be done with it. You'll be free. Truly free. We'll get you the best surgeons in Moscow. No strings attached." Lyra's mind spun. Enzio's confession on the terrace had felt so real, so raw. But Victor's words planted a seed of doubt that sprouted instantly. Why hadn't Enzio deleted the drive yet? "Lyra!" Enzio's roar echoed through the orchard. A split second later, a bullet barked, thudding into the trunk of the olive tree inches from Victor's head. Victor didn't flinch. He glanced toward the villa, then back to Lyra. "Think about it, Starlight. The Tyrant loves his toys. He doesn't love his equals. In a flash of movement, Victor vaulted over the stone wall and disappeared into the dense brush of the cliffside. Enzio burst through the lemon trees, his gun drawn, his face a mask of primal fury. Cassian and 2 other men followed close behind. Enzio reached Lyra in 3 strides, grabbing her shoulders and scanning her for injuries. "Did he touch you? Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a rage she had never seen. "I'm fine," Lyra said, pulling away from him. She looked at his gun, then at the villa, then at the man who claimed to be her husband. "He said you haven't deleted the drive. He said you're waiting for me to fail." Enzio's eyes went dark. He lowered the gun, his chest heaving. "He's a Volkov, Lyra. He's trying to manipulate you." "Then delete it now," she challenged, her voice rising. "Go into that study, plug it in, and burn it all. Prove to me that I'm not just an investment waiting for a final phase." The silence that followed was deafening. Enzio didn't move. He didn't promise. He only looked at her with an expression that was part agony and part ironclad resolve. "I can't," he whispered. "Not yet." Lyra stepped back, the Mediterranean sun suddenly feeling like an ice-cold weight. She didn't wait for his explanation. She turned and ran back toward the villa, the white silk of her dress fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. That night, a storm rolled in from the sea. Thunder shook the foundations of the villa, and lightning illuminated the stone corridors in jagged bursts of violet light. Lyra sat by the window in her room, watching the rain lash against the glass. Her heart felt heavy, a dull ache that medication couldn't reach. She reached into the hidden pocket of her dress and pulled out the silver thumb drive. She had taken it back from Enzio's desk while he was in the orchard. She knew she should destroy it. She should throw it into the sea and let the waves take the Starlight project forever. But Victor's words haunted her. A synthetic transplant. A machine owned by Valerius. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the cold tiles. She moved toward the door, intending to find a laptop in the library, to see the truth for herself. But as she reached for the handle, the door swung open. Enzio was standing there. He looked haggard, his shirt unbuttoned, a bottle of dark Sicilian wine in his hand. He looked at her, then his eyes dropped to the drive in her hand. "I knew you took it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Then take it back," Lyra said, holding it out. "If it's so precious, take it." Enzio didn't take the drive. He walked into the room, closing the door behind him. He set the wine bottle on the table and turned to her, the lightning outside casting his shadow long across the bed. "I can't delete it, because the final phase isn't a transplant, Lyra," he said, his voice breaking. "It's a map. It's a list of the other families, the ones my father worked with. They have the other components. If I delete this drive, I lose the ability to track them down and stop them from doing to other girls what he did to Bianca, and what he almost did to you." He walked toward her, stopping only when their breath mingled in the dark room. He reached out, his hand finally resting on her waist, pulling her flush against him. "I'm not waiting for you to fail," he whispered against her lips. "I'm waiting for the strength to burn the whole world down so you can finally be free. But I need you to trust me, just for a little longer." Lyra looked into his eyes, searching for the tyrant, but finding only the boy who had jumped into the black water 11 years ago. She felt the drive slip from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. She reached up, her hands framing his face, her thumbs tracing the scars of his battles. "Don't burn the world, Enzio," she breathed. "Just be in it with me." As the thunder roared outside, Enzio leaned down, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was desperate, hungry, and filled with a decade of unspoken longing. For the first time, Lyra didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a storm. But as they lost themselves in each other, a single red light flickered on the security panel by the door. The perimeter had been breached again, and this time, Viktor Volkov hadn't come alone. The explosion didn't just shake the villa, it tore the night in two. The rhythmic thrum of the Sicilian rain was obliterated by the screech of twisting metal and the percussive roar of C4. Lyra was thrown from the bed, the marble floor rising up to meet her with a jarring impact that sent a spike of agony through her chest. For a terrifying second, her heart stuttered, the valves struggling to find their rhythm in the wake of the shockwave. Lyra! Enzio was on her in an instant, his heavy frame shielding her from the rain of plaster and glass shards. The room was illuminated by a hellish orange glow. The lemon orchards were on fire. The Volkovs hadn't just breached the perimeter, they had brought the sun to the cliffs of Sicily. I'm okay, Lyra gasped, clutching his forearms. Her vision swam with silver spots. What happened? Victor brought a strike team, Enzio growled, pulling her to her feet with a frantic strength. He reached into the wreckage of the bedside table and pulled out a tactical vest, shoving her arms through it. They didn't come for the drive. They came to burn the house of Valerius to the ground. The sound of submachine gun fire erupted from the hallway, the staccato rhythm of Cassian's defense. Enzio grabbed his customized HK-416, his eyes locking onto Lyra's with a primal, desperate intensity. Listen to me. The villa is lost. There is a tunnel in the cellar that leads to a private cove. Cassian is clearing the path. You stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you don't look back. Do you understand? Enzio! Do you understand? He roared over the sound of a second explosion. Yes. They burst into the corridor. The air was thick with white dust and the acrid smell of cordite. Two masked men in grey tactical gear rounded the corner. Enzio didn't hesitate. He fired 3 rounds, clean, clinical, and lethal. The men dropped like puppets with their strings cut. They moved through the villa, a nightmare landscape of shattered heirlooms and blood-stained marble. In the grand foyer, Cassian was a whirlwind of violence, pinned behind a fallen statue of Romulus, holding back a flood of attackers. "Boss, the cove is compromised. You have to take the mountain road," Cassian yelled, his jaw bleeding, his eyes wild. Enzio swore a low, guttural sound. He grabbed a set of keys from the wall rack near the kitchen, the keys to the vintage Alfa Romeo kept in the reinforced garage. "Cassian, meet us at the rendezvous in Tuscany. Don't you dare die." "Go," Cassian roared, tossing a frag grenade toward the main entrance. The garage door hissed open just as a rocket-propelled grenade impacted the upper floor of the villa. The ceiling groaned, ancient stone raining down on the hood of the car. Enzio shoved Lyra into the passenger seat, vaulted over the door, and slammed the car into gear. The Alfa Romeo screamed, its tires biting into the gravel as they tore out of the burning estate. Behind them, the Villa Valerius, the seat of Enzio's power for 4 centuries, was engulfed in a pillar of flame. "They're behind us," Lyra whispered, her eyes fixed on the side mirror. 2 black SUVs were weaving through the lemon trees, their headlights cutting through the smoke like the eyes of predators. "Hold on," Enzio commanded. The mountain road was a ribbon of wet asphalt clinging to the edge of the cliff. Enzio drove with a suicidal precision, the car drifting inches from the abyss. The SUVs opened fire, bullets shattering the Alpha's rear window, glass raining down on Lyra's hair. "Enzio, the bridge!" Lyra screamed. 100 yards ahead, a small stone bridge spanned a deep gorge. Viktor Volkov was standing in the center of the road, a rocket launcher perched on his shoulder. He looked like a god of ruin in the lightning flashes. "He's going to blow it," Enzio panted. He reached over, grabbing Lyra's hand for one fleeting second. "I love you, Lyra. Remember that." "Enzio, no!" He didn't hit the brakes. He floored the accelerator. Just as Victor pulled the trigger, Enzio yanked the steering wheel, sending the car careening off the road, through a wooden fence and down a steep, grassy embankment. The rocket screamed overhead, impacting the bridge and sending a rain of stone into the gorge. The Alpha tumbled, a sickening kaleidoscope of metal and earth, before slamming into a grove of ancient oaks at the base of the hill. Silence followed, only the ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of the rain. Lyra opened her eyes. The car was upside down. She was hanging by her seatbelt, the blood rushing to her head. Beside her, Enzio was slumped against the steering wheel, a deep gash on his forehead, painting his face crimson. "Enzio," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Enzio, wake up." He didn't move. Above them, on the road, she heard the screech of tires. The Volkovs were coming down, panic, cold and sharp, laced through her. She reached for the release on her belt. She fell, her shoulder hitting the roof of the car. She scrambled over to Enzio, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. It was there, slow but steady. She looked out the shattered window. The flashlights of the strike team were flickering through the trees. They were less than a minute away. She saw Enzio's handgun on the floorboards. She grabbed it. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of death. She looked at the man she had hated, feared, and finally, desperately loved. "Not today," she whispered. She crawled out of the wreckage, dragging Enzio's limp body with her. The effort sent a searing pain through her heart, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She pulled him into the deep shadows of a nearby cave entrance, a hidden shepherd's path she had noticed on the villa's maps. She collapsed beside him, her hand over his mouth to muffle any sound, as the boots of the Volkov team crunched through the grass inches from their hiding spot. "Where are they?" Victor's voice was a low snarl. "Find them. The girl must be alive." Lyra held her breath until her lungs burned. She watched through the tall grass as Victor stood over the wreckage of the car. He kicked the door, his face twisted in a mask of beautiful, terrifying rage. "They're gone," one of the men called out. "There's blood, but no bodies. They must have headed for the coast." "Search the caves," Victor commanded. Lyra gripped the gun, her finger trembling on the trigger. She looked at Enzio's pale face. "Please wake up. Please." Suddenly, a low whistle echoed from the woods. Not a bird, but a signal. The Volkov men paused. "Sir, the Italian carabinieri are coming up the back road. We have to move." Victor stared at the cave entrance for a long, agonizing moment. It felt as if his blue eyes could see through the shadows, straight into Lyra's soul. Then he spat on the ground and turned away. "This isn't over, Starlight," he muttered. "The Tyrant can't hide you in the dirt forever." 2 days later, the air was different. The salt of the sea had been replaced by the rich, loamy scent of sun-drenched earth and fermenting grapes. Tuscany. They were in a battered Fiat, a vehicle Enzio had secured from a friend in the valley. Enzio was driving, his head bandaged, his arm in a sling. He looked like a man who had been through a war and lost everything but the woman beside him. "We're almost there," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "The Disano estate in Montepulciano. Your aunt, Contessa Elena. My father told everyone she was dead, but she was just exiled. She refused to sign the Starlight protocols." Lyra looked out at the rolling hills, the cypress trees standing like sentinels against the golden afternoon light. "Why didn't you tell me I had family left?" "Because your father didn't want you to know," Enzio said, his gaze fixed on the road. "He was afraid Elena would tell you the truth about your mother, that she didn't die of a heart attack, Lyra. She died trying to run away with you when you were 3. Lyra's breath hitched. Another lie. The house of Disano was built on a foundation of bones and deceit. They turned into a long, winding driveway lined with ancient olive trees. At the end stood a villa that looked nothing like the Valerius fortress. It was warm, covered in climbing ivy and blooming bougainvillea. An elderly woman stood on the porch, her silver hair tied in a sharp bun, her eyes as blue and defiant as Lyra's. Contessa Elena Di Sano. The car stopped. Lyra stepped out, her legs shaky. Elena walked down the steps, her gaze moving from Lyra to the battered Enzio. She stopped in front of Lyra, her hand reaching out to touch the girl's cheek with a tenderness that made Lyra's vision blur. "You have your mother's eyes," Elena whispered, "and her fire." She turned her gaze to Enzio, her expression sharpening into a blade of ice. "And you, the son of Silas. You look like you finally realized that a heart isn't something you can own, Valerius." "I have, Contessa," Enzio said, bowing his head. "Good. Then come inside. We have much to discuss. The Volkovs are moving on New York, and your father—" She looked at Lyra. "Lorenzo has woken up, but he isn't calling for you, Lyra. He's calling for Valia." The world seemed to tilt. What? No, that's impossible. He saw what she did. "He sees what he wants to see," Elena said, leading them into the cool, shaded interior of the villa. "And right now, he wants his empire back. He's made a deal with the Russians to trade the Valerius ports for his own freedom." Lyra looked at Enzio. He stood in the doorway, the golden Tuscan light outlining his scarred face. He looked at her, and for the first time, there was no tyrant in his eyes. There was only the man who had jumped into the water. "We're not going to let them, are we?" Lyra asked, her voice hardening. Enzio reached out, his hand finding hers. "No, we're going back to New York. But this time, we aren't going as a debt and a collector." He squeezed her hand, his eyes silver and fierce. "We're going as the heads of the House of Valerius, and we're going to burn their world down together." The skyline of Manhattan didn't welcome them back. It loomed like a jagged crown of glass and steel against a bruised purple sky. Returning to New York felt like stepping back into the mouth of a predator that had already tasted their blood. Enzio and Lyra sat in the back of a nondescript delivery van, a far cry from the armoured Maybachs of their past life. Enzio's face was a map of healing scars, his eyes shadowed by the weight of the silver thumb drive tucked into his tactical vest. Across from them, Cassian sat in grim silence, his hands methodically checking the action on a suppressed submachine gun. He had survived Sicily by crawling through the burning orchards, and the fire had left him even more lethal. "We move tonight," Enzio said, his voice a low vibration that barely carried over the hum of the engine. "Lorenzo has moved his headquarters to the penthouse of the Disano Plaza. He's surrounded by Volkov's men. It's not a recovery ward, it's a war room." Lyra looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She wore black tactical silk, her starlight rose necklace replaced by a thin, concealed wire saw, and a heartbeat monitor synced to Enzio's wrist. She could feel the proprietary compound flowing through her, a cold, chemical strength that kept her heart steady even as her mind raced. "My father, he's really betrayed us," Lyra asked, her voice a fragile blade. "He's trading the Valerius ports to the Russians just to get out from under Valia's thumb?" "It's worse than that, Lyra," Cassian grunted, not looking up. "He's not under her thumb. He's her partner. The shooting at the gala, it was a cull. They were cleaning out the old guard to make room for the Volkov merger." The van slowed to a stop in a service alley beneath the Disano Plaza. The air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and ozone. "Stay behind me," Enzio commanded, his hand finding the small of Lyra's back. "If we find him, I do the talking. You keep your eyes on Valia." The ascent was a blur of shadows. They bypassed the main elevators, using a service lift Enzio had hacked days in advance. When the doors opened onto the 60th floor, the smell of jasmine hit Lyra like a physical blow. Valia. They moved through the darkened office, their footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. In the center of the room, a massive mahogany table was set for dinner. Crystal glasses caught the moonlight, and the scent of expensive steak and red wine mingled with the jasmine. At the head of the table sat Lorenzo Di Sano. He looked older, his skin like parchment, but his eyes were wide and manic. Beside him, Valia sat in a gown of blood-red silk, her fingers stroking the stem of a wine glass. And at the far end of the table, Victor Volkov sat, his blue eyes fixed on the entrance long before they stepped into the light. "You're late for dinner, children," Lorenzo said, his voice a dry, rattling rasp. Enzio stepped into the light, his gun raised, but he didn't fire. He couldn't. 4 red laser dots appeared on his chest instantly. Victor's snipers were already in position. "Father," Lyra whispered, stepping out from behind Enzio. "How could you? You sold me. You sold our family." Lorenzo laughed, a sound that ended in a wet cough. "Family is a luxury for the weak, Lyra. I didn't sell you, I invested you. And now, the investment is about to pay the ultimate dividend." He gestured to the center of the table where a small, sleek medical briefcase sat. It was open, revealing a series of vials glowing with a faint, bioluminescent blue. "The Starlight project was never about a transplant, Enzio," Valia purred, her eyes shining with a sickening triumph. "Silas was a fool. He thought he needed a heart. We realized we only needed the enzyme that the heart produces under extreme duress. The one your sister's body synthesized before she died. The one Lyra's body has been perfecting for 11 years. Lyra's hand went to her throat. Every dose of the proprietary compound she had taken, it wasn't medicine, it was a catalyst. "You've been farming her," Enzio growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You didn't want to save her heart. You were using it as a laboratory." "And tonight is the harvest," Victor said, standing up. He walked toward the briefcase, his movements slow and deliberate. "The Volkovs have the distribution network. The Disanos have the source. All we need now is the final encryption key to unlock the synthesis sequence. The one on that silver drive in your pocket, Enzio." Enzio looked at Lyra. In the cold, clinical light of the penthouse, she looked like a ghost again, pale, fragile, and doomed. But Lyra didn't look at the briefcase. She looked at Victor. "You told me in Sicily that Enzio was the one who wanted to control me," Lyra said, her voice steady. "But you're the ones who want to bottle me. You want to sell my blood by the milligram." She reached into her tactical suit and pulled out a small, glass vial, one she had filled from the medical bay in Tuscany before they left. "This is the enzyme, isn't it?" she asked, holding it up. "The Starlight essence." Valia leaned forward, her eyes hungry. "Give it to me, Lyra, and I'll let Enzio live. I'll let you go to Switzerland. You can live in a palace, a golden cage where no one will ever hurt you again." "Lyra, don't," Enzio warned, his eyes never leaving Victor. Lyra looked at her father. "Is this what Mother died for? Trying to keep me from this?" Lorenzo didn't look at her. He looked at the blue vials. "Your mother was a romantic. She didn't understand the price of immortality." Lyra's hand tightened around the vial. A slow, cold smile touched her lips, a smile that was all Valerius, and none of the Starlight rose. "Then let's see what immortality is worth," she said. In one swift movement, she smashed the vial against the edge of the table. The blue liquid splattered across the mahogany, mixing with the spilled wine. At the same time, she reached out and slammed her hand onto the open briefcase, her wire saw cutting through the delicate glass vials within. "No!" Valia screamed, lunging across the table. Now! Enzio roared. The penthouse exploded into violence. Enzio fired, his bullets taking out the two guards nearest the table. Cassian dropped from the ceiling vents, his submachine gun barking as he laid down a wall of lead. Victor lunged for Lyra, his hand catching her throat, but Enzio was faster. He slammed into the younger Volkov, the two men crashing through a glass partition and onto the balcony, 60 floors above the street. Lyra scrambled back, her heart screaming in her chest. She saw Valia reaching for a hidden pistol in her silk gown. Lyra didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the table and swung it with everything she had. The glass shattered against Valia's temple. The Black Widow collapsed, her blood mixing with the blue enzyme on the floor. "Father, stop!" Lyra cried as Lorenzo tried to crawl toward the ruined briefcase, his hands clawing at the broken glass. "It's mine. It was all for me." Lorenzo wheezed, his eyes glazed with madness. Lyra stood over him, her chest heaving, the proprietary compound finally failing. Her vision began to grey at the edges. She looked out towards the balcony where Enzio and Victor were locked in a dance of death. The wind was howling, a storm of glass and blood. Victor had a knife at Enzio's throat, but Enzio had his hand on the silver drive, holding it over the edge of the abyss. "Drop it, Valerius," Victor snarled. "Without the drive, the project dies. You'll never save her." "That's the point, Victor," Enzio panted, his eyes meeting Lyra's through the shattered glass. "She doesn't need to be saved by a ghost." Enzio opened his hand. The silver drive fell, disappearing into the blackness of New York City. Victor roared in fury, lunging for Enzio's throat, but the Tyrant was ready. He pivoted, using Victor's momentum against him, and sent the Volkov heir stumbling back, straight over the railing. There was no scream, only the sound of the wind. Enzio stumbled back into the penthouse, his shirt torn, his body broken. He reached Lyra just as her knees gave way. He caught her, pulling her into his lap amidst the ruin of the Disano Empire. "It's over," he whispered, his blood dripping onto her black silk. "I destroyed it. The drive, the vials. It's all gone." Lyra looked at her father, who lay still among the broken glass. She looked at Valia, who was slumped in the shadows. The Starlight Project was dead. The debt was settled. "Enzio!" she gasped, her heart giving one final erratic thud. "My heart, it's stopping." "No," Enzio growled, his hands framing her face. "No, stay with me. Cassian, get the medics. Now." "Enzio," Lyra whispered, a faint, beautiful smile touching her lips. "I'm not a lab anymore. I'm just me." Her eyes closed. Outside, the first light of dawn began to touch the skyline, turning the glass towers of New York into pillars of gold. In the silent penthouse, the Tyrant held his rose, and for the first time in 11 years, the city was quiet. But as Enzio pressed his forehead against hers, he felt it, a faint, steady throb against his palms. A heartbeat, fragile, unengineered, and entirely her own. The air in the Italian Alps did not taste of blood or jasmine. It tasted of pine, ancient snow, and a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight. High above the clouds, tucked into a jagged crevice of the Dolomites, sat Lerimo, the hermitage. It was a villa built of dark stone and reinforced steel, accessible only by a single-track road that Enzio had ordered rigged with enough explosives to bring the mountain down. This was not the sun-drenched beauty of Sicily or the rolling vines of Tuscany. This was a fortress of ice. It had been 3 weeks since the night at Disano Plaza. 3 weeks since Enzio had watched the silver drive vanish into the Manhattan abyss. and 3 weeks since Lyra's heart had decided, against all odds, to keep beating without the Starlight catalyst. Lyra stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the master suite, wrapped in a heavy cashmere robe the colour of wood smoke. Outside, a blizzard was turning the world into a white void. "The doctor from Milan will be here tomorrow," Enzio's voice came from the doorway. He was a silhouette against the hallway light, his arm still in a sling, his presence a dark, grounding force in the vast room. "He's bringing the new portable monitors. He says your natural rhythm is stabilizing, but the altitude—" "The altitude is fine, Enzio," Lyra interrupted, not turning around. "My heart isn't the thing that feels heavy anymore." Enzio walked into the room, his footsteps silent on the thick wool rugs. He stopped behind her, his heat radiating through the cashmere. He didn't touch her. Since they had arrived, he had treated her with a reverence that felt almost like distance. "We had to leave, Lyra," he said quietly. "In New York, you are a ghost. To the FBI, you're a victim of a kidnapping they can't prove. To the Volkov remnants, you're a bounty. Here, you're nothing, and that's the only way you stay alive." Lyra finally turned to face him. The starlight rose was gone. In her place was a woman with hollowed cheeks and eyes that had seen the bottom of the world. She reached out, her fingers tracing the dark stubble along his jaw. "And you?" she whispered. "What are you here, Enzio? You've abandoned your docks, your construction sites, your empire. You're a king without a country." Enzio's eyes, usually as cold as the peaks outside, softened for a fraction of a second. He caught her hand, pressing her palm to his mouth. "I am exactly where I chose to be. I spent 11 years preparing for a war. I didn't realize that the peace would be the hardest part to survive." Life in Lerimo was a series of quiet rituals. There were no phones, no internet, only a satellite link that Cassian monitored from a bunker beneath the garage. Lyra spent her days in the library, reading through the Disano journals she had managed to save, while Enzio spent his patrolling the perimeter or staring at the fireplace as if he could see the faces of the men he'd killed in the embers. But the past was not a dog that stayed where it was told to sit. One evening, while the wind howled like a wounded beast against the stone walls, Cassian entered the dining hall. He looked frayed, his tactical gear dusted with frost. "Boss," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The satellite picked up a signature. A private heli vessel landed in Bolzano 2 hours ago. It's not the doctor." Enzio stood up instantly, his hand going to the pistol at the small of his back. "Who is it?" "A courier," Cassian said, stepping aside. Behind him stood a man Lyra recognized, Edward Holloway, her father's personal attorney, the man who had overseen the collateral contract. He looked absurd in his charcoal wool coat, his leather briefcase clutched against his chest like a shield. "Mr. Valerius," Holloway said, his breath hitching. "I apologize for the intrusion, but there are matters, legal echoes that the falling drive didn't silence." Lyra stepped forward, her heart giving a warning thud. "My father? Is he—" "Lorenzo is in federal custody, Lyra," Holloway said, looking at her with a mixture of pity and fear. "But before the agents took him, he triggered a secondary trust, a dead man's switch buried in the Disano Valerius merger." Holloway opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of vellum. "The contract wasn't just about Lyra being the debt," the lawyer whispered. "It was about the heart itself. Lorenzo filed a patent on your DNA, Lyra. He claimed your heart as intellectual property belonging to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. As of yesterday, the Volkov creditors have seized that corporation." Enzio snatched the paper from Holloway's hand. As he read, the air in the room seemed to freeze. The tyrant returned to his face, the eyes narrowing, the jaw locking into a ridge of bone. "They aren't coming to kill her," Enzio hissed, the vellum crumpling in his grip. "They're coming to repossess her." "Legally, they have a claim to move her to a secure research facility for asset preservation," Holloway explained. "They've filed for an international extraction order. Even here, the Italian authorities might be forced to comply if they want to avoid a diplomatic incident." Lyra felt a laugh bubble up in her throat, a jagged, hysterical sound. "My DNA. I'm a patent. I'm not even a person anymore. I'm a trade secret." She walked toward the fireplace, staring into the flames. 11 years, Enzio. 11 years you fought to keep me alive, and I'm still just a piece of paper to them. Enzio was across the room in 3 strides. He grabbed Holloway by the lapels, lifting the older man off his feet. "Who is leading the creditors? Who signed the extraction order?" Holloway's voice trembled. It's Victor's father, Ivan Volkov. He's not interested in the medicine anymore, Enzio. He wants vengeance. He wants to take Lyra because it's the only way to kill you without firing a bullet." Enzio dropped the lawyer. He turned to Cassian. "How long until they reach the mountain?" "The storm is holding them in Bolzano," Cassian said, checking his watch. "But they have mountain-grade transports. 5 hours, maybe 6. Enzio looked at Lyra. She was standing by the fire, the light outlining the delicate, fragile shape of her. He realized then that he couldn't hide her anymore. He couldn't build a cage strong enough or a mountain high enough to keep the world out. He walked to her, his hands cupping her face. "We're not staying here," he whispered. "Where are we going?" she asked. "There's nowhere left." "We're going to Bolzano," Enzio said, his voice a lethal promise. "If Ivan wants to repossess an asset, I'm going to show him exactly what it costs to touch what belongs to me." "Enzio, your heart," she started, her eyes wide. "My heart stopped the day I pulled you from the water, Lyra," he said, pressing his forehead against hers. "Every beat I've had since then has been a loan from you. I'm going to settle this debt once and for all." He turned to Cassian. "Rig the villa. If they reach this peak, I want them to find nothing but a crater." "And the girl?" Cassian asked. "The girl is coming with me," Enzio said. He looked at Lyra, a dark, reckless fire in his eyes. "You said you wanted to be in the world with me, Lyra. Tonight, we're going to burn the last of the contracts. We're going to show the Volkovs that the Starlight Rose has thorns made of Valerius steel." Lyra felt her heart thud, not out of weakness, but out of a sudden, fierce rush of adrenaline. She reached into her robe and pulled out the small, decorative knife she had kept since Sicily. "I'm ready," she said. As the blizzard screamed outside, the Tyrant and his Rose stepped out into the white void. The velvet exile was over. The hunt had begun. Bolzano was a city of contradictions, a medieval heart wrapped in the cold, industrial shell of Alpine commerce. As the storm descended from the Dolomites, the city was transformed into a landscape of swirling white and neon blue. Enzio drove the reinforced Mercedes G-Wagon through the slush, his eyes fixed on the illuminated spire of the Grand Hotel Lorin. Beside him, Lyra was dressed in charcoal tactical gear, a heavy wool coat draped over her shoulders. The heartbeat monitor on her wrist hummed a steady, rhythmic green. "Ivan Volkov doesn't operate like Victor," Enzio said, his voice as sharp as the frost on the windshield. "Victor was a predator who enjoyed the chase. Ivan is a bookkeeper. He sees people as numbers on a ledger. To him, you are a deficit he needs to correct." "And what are you to him, Enzio?" Lyra asked, checking the slide on the compact handgun Cassian had given her. "A bad debt that needs to be written off." They pulled into the underground garage of the hotel. Cassian was already there, having arrived 30 minutes earlier in a separate vehicle. He met them at the elevator, his face shadowed by a heavy hood. "Floor 4 is locked down," Cassian reported. Ivan has the Imperial suite. He's brought his own legal team and a medical extraction crew. They have a surgical transport waiting at the private airfield. Enzio's jaw tightened. They're not wasting time. There's more, Cassian added, his eyes meeting Enzio's. Ivan didn't just bring lawyers. He brought a woman, a Dr. Greta Valerius. Enzio froze. The name hit him like a physical blow, stripping the air from his lungs. Lyra looked between the two men, her heart skipping a beat. Greta, Lyra whispered. Another Valerius. My father's sister, Enzio rasped, his voice thick with a decade of buried resentment. The one who actually designed the Starlight project. Silas was the money, but Greta was the mind. I thought she had died in the Zurich labs years ago. She didn't die, Cassian said. She went to the Volkovs. She's the one who verified the intellectual property claim on Lyra's DNA. The fourth floor smelled of sterile lavender and expensive leather. Enzio didn't sneak. He walked down the hallway with the weight of a man who owned the ground he stood upon. When he reached the double doors of the Imperial suite, he didn't knock. He kicked the doors open. The room was vast, filled with velvet sofas and antique maps. Ivan Volkov sat at a glass desk, his hair silver, his face a mask of aristocratic boredom. Beside him stood a woman in a lab coat that looked out of place in the luxury suite. She was older, with Enzio's silver eyes, and a mouth that was a thin, cruel line. Enzio, Ivan said, not looking up from a document. You always were fond of dramatic entrances. It's a pity you didn't inherit Silas's appreciation for paperwork. Ivan, Enzio growled, his hand hovering near his weapon. And Greta. I see the devil has a long memory. Greta Valerius stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Lyra with a clinical, terrifying curiosity. So this is the survivor, the girl who kept the Starlight burning when my niece's heart went cold. Lyra stepped out from behind Enzio, her chin lifting. I'm not a project, Greta, and I'm not a niece's replacement. I'm the woman who's going to watch your family name turn to ash. Greta's laugh was a dry, rattling sound. Spirited, that's the adrenaline. It's good for the enzyme production. Ivan, we should begin the sedative. We have a long flight to Moscow. She's not going anywhere, Enzio said, the gun finally clearing his holster. Instantly, 6 Volkov guards emerged from the shadows of the suite, their rifles leveled at Enzio and Lyra. Ivan Volkov stood up, walking towards them with a slow, measured gait. He stopped a few feet away, his blue eyes, so like Victor's, full of a cold, predatory light. You think this is about a patent, Enzio? Ivan asked. You think I care about DNA sequences and shell corporations? I have more money than I can spend in 10 lifetimes. Then why are you here? Enzio spat. Because Silas Valerius owed me something far more valuable than a port, Ivan said. He promised me a cure for my own bloodline. The Volkov men, we are born with a curse. A degenerative neurological decay. Victor was already showing the signs. I am dying, Enzio, and Greta tells me that Lyra's heart doesn't just produce an enzyme for cardiac repair, it produces a neuroregenerative protein. Lyra felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't just about her heart, it was about her very essence. She was a fountain of youth for monsters. Silas didn't just want to save Bianca, Greta added, her voice chillingly calm. He wanted to create a master bloodline, a bridge between the Valerius mind and the Volkov strength. You and Lyra, Enzio, you were meant to be the beginning of something new. Your father didn't rescue her for you. He rescued her for the merger. Enzio's hand trembled. The collateral contract. It wasn't a debt payment. It was a breeding pact. You're lying, Enzio whispered. Ask your mother's ghost, Greta sneered. Why do you think she fled to Sicily? She found the journals. She knew Silas was going to use his own son as a vessel for the Volkov blood. The room seemed to tilt. the tyrant, the king of the docks, the man who had built a kingdom of shadows. He was just another experiment. He and Lyra were two halves of a dark, engineered puzzle. Lyra looked at Enzio. She saw the devastation in his eyes, the way the world he had fought to control was shattering around him. She reached out, her hand finding his, her fingers interlacing with his bruised knuckles. "It doesn't matter," Lyra said, her voice ringing with a sudden, fierce clarity. "It doesn't matter what they planned. We aren't their projects. We're us." She looked at Ivan Volkov. "You want the protein? You want the cure? Then you're going to have to take it from a dead heart. Because I'd rather stop my own pulse right here than let a drop of my blood save a man like you." She moved the gun she was holding, but she didn't point it at Ivan. She pointed it at her own chest. "Lyra, no!" Enzio roared. "Let her go, Ivan," Lyra said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Let Enzio and Cassian walk out of this hotel. If they aren't clear of the garage in 5 minutes, I pull the trigger. You'll have a corpse and a ruined patent. No cure, no legacy, just a bloodstain on your imperial suite." Ivan stared at her. For the first time, the aristocratic boredom vanished. He saw the fire in the Starlight Rose, and he realized he was looking at a woman who truly had nothing left to lose. "Greta?" Ivan asked, his voice tight. "Can we harvest from a fresh trauma?" "The protein degrades within seconds of cardiac arrest," Greta hissed. "We need her alive and stable for the extraction." Ivan turned his gaze back to Enzio. "You have 5 minutes. Leave the girl and you live." Enzio didn't move. He looked at Lyra, his silver eyes filled with an agony so deep it felt like the mountain itself was weeping. "I won't leave you," he whispered. "You have to," Lyra said, tears finally breaking. "Go. Find the others. Burn the journals. End it, Enzio. Be the tyrant one last time and destroy their world." She stepped back, the gun steady against her heart. Enzio looked at the guards, at Ivan, and finally at Greta. Then he did something no one in the room expected. He lowered his weapon and reached into his tactical vest. He pulled out a small black detonator. "The garage is rigged," Enzio said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "So is the floor below us. I didn't come here to negotiate, Ivan. I came to settle the account." He looked at Lyra, a sad, beautiful smile touching his lips. "We go together, Starlight, or we don't go at all." As the 5-minute timer on the detonator began to tick, the storm outside the Grand Hotel Lorin finally broke the windows, and the cold air of the Alps rushed in to meet the fire of the Valerius bloodline. The countdown on the detonator was a steady, rhythmic heartbeat of crimson light against the darkness of the imperial suite. 4:59. 4:58. The wind from the shattered windows howled, a banshee scream that scattered the legal documents and medical charts like autumn leaves. The scent of ozone and impending fire choked the room. In the chaos of the alpine storm, the power lines outside flickered and died, plunging the Grand Hotel Lorin into a nightmare of emergency strobes and long, jagged shadows. Even Volkov didn't move. He stood like a statue of ice, his eyes fixed on the detonator in Enzio's hand. "You're bluffing, Enzio. You wouldn't kill her. You've spent half your life making sure she keeps breathing." "I'm not killing her, Ivan," Enzio said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "I'm liberating her. I'm taking the choice away from you, from Greta, and from the ghosts of our fathers." He looked at Lyra. She still held the gun to her own chest, her finger white on the trigger. She wasn't trembling anymore. The fear had burned away, leaving only the starlight fire. "Cassian, go!" Enzio commanded. "Boss!" "That's an order!" Enzio roared. "Take the stairs. Clear the lobby. If the detonator hits 0 and we aren't behind you, you know what to do." Cassian hesitated for a heartbeat, his scarred face a mask of grief. Then he vanished into the shadows of the hallway, a silent reaper clearing the path. Greta Valerius stepped forward, her face twisted in a sneer. "You fool! You think a bomb ends the bloodline? The data is already on the Volkov servers. Even if you blow this hotel to hell, the project continues." "Not without the source," Lyra said, her voice ringing out over the wind. She turned her gaze to Greta. "You spent years looking at me through a microscope, but you never saw the woman. You only saw the heart. Well, look at me now, Greta. I am the end of your life's work." Lyra lowered the gun from her chest, but she didn't drop it. In one fluid motion, she aimed it at the medical briefcase on the desk and fired. The blue vials shattered. The bioluminescent enzymes splattered across Ivan's desk, glowing like a dying star before the cold air of the Alps turned it into a dull, grey sludge. "No!" Greta shrieked, lunging toward the desk. Ivan moved then, his calm finally breaking. He reached for the suppressed pistol in his waistband, but Enzio was faster. The Tyrant lunged across the space, his shoulder slamming into Ivan's chest. The two men crashed into the heavy mahogany table, glass and fine china shattering under their weight. "Lyra, run!" Enzio panted, his hands locked around Ivan's throat. But Lyra didn't run. She saw two Volkov guards raising their rifles. She didn't think. She didn't wait for her heart to give permission. She fired. One guard went down, clutching his shoulder. She fired again, the recoil jarring her bones, and the second guard retreated into the shadows of the bedroom. "Get to the service lift!" Enzio yelled, throwing a punch that cracked Ivan's jaw. Ivan roared, a sound of primal, neurological agony. He grabbed a heavy bronze bust from the desk and swung it, catching Enzio across the ribs. Enzio gasped, the detonator slipping from his hand and sliding across the floor toward the shattered window. 2:15. Lyra dived for the detonator, her fingers brushing the cold metal just as Greta's heel slammed onto her wrist. Lyra cried out, the pain a white-hot flash that mirrored the lightning outside. "Give it to me, you little brat," Greta hissed, reaching down to grab Lyra's hair. Lyra rolled, her hand finding the small, decorative knife hidden in her tactical suit. She didn't aim for Greta's heart. She aimed for her leg. The blade sank deep into Greta's thigh. The older woman screamed, collapsing to the floor. Lyra grabbed the detonator. She looked at Enzio. He was pinned against the railing of the balcony, Ivan's hands around his throat, the two men swaying over the 60-foot drop to the street below. "Enzio!" Lyra screamed. She ran toward the balcony, but a Volkov guard intercepted her, his rifle butt slamming into her stomach. Lyra fell, the air leaving her lungs in a wheeze. Her heart monitor chirped a frantic, rhythmic red. "Danger! Danger!" Enzio saw her fall. Something in him, the last of the Tyrant, or perhaps the first of the man, broke. He didn't fight Ivan for his life anymore, he fought for hers. He let out a guttural roar, his thumbs digging into the pressure points beneath Ivan's ears. Ivan's grip loosened. Enzio didn't wait. He grabbed Ivan's lapels and threw himself backward over the railing. "Enzio!" Lyra's scream was lost in a peal of thunder. She scrambled to the edge of the balcony, her heart feeling as if it were tearing apart. Below, in the swirling snow, she saw two figures hit the heavy canvas awning of the third-floor terrace. The fabric groaned and tore, dumping both men into the deep, unplowed snow of the hotel gardens. 1 o'clock. Lyra looked at the detonator. 1 minute, she turned and ran for the stairs. She didn't use the elevator, she threw herself down the service stairwell, her feet flying over the concrete, her lungs burning with a fire that felt like liquid lead. She reached the ground floor just as the first muffled thud of the sub-basement charges shook the building. She burst out into the hotel gardens. The snow was waist-deep in places, a cold, suffocating blanket. She saw the torn awning above, and then she saw him. Enzio was struggling to stand, his face a mask of blood and ice. A few yards away, Ivan Volkov lay still, his body twisted at an unnatural angle against a stone fountain. Enzio! Lyra fell into the snow beside him, her hands frantically checking his chest, his face, his warmth. You're alive. You're alive. Go, he gasped, his voice a bloody whisper. The hotel, the secondary charges. He looked up at the towering facade of the Grand Hotel Lauren. Small rhythmic explosions were already blowing out the windows of the lower floors. The building was beginning to groan, a tectonic sound of dying architecture. I'm not leaving without you, Lyra said, her voice hard with a terrifying resolve. She hauled his arm over her shoulder. Every step was a battle. Her heart was a frantic, jagged mess. The monitor on her wrist a steady, screaming siren of red light. But she didn't stop. She dragged the King of the Docks through the snow, away from the shadow of the falling hotel. They were 50 yards away when the Imperial Suite exploded. The top floor of the hotel turned into a pillar of white and orange fire. The shockwave knocked them both flat into the snow. Lyra looked back as the Grand Hotel Lauren, the site of the Volkovs' final stand, began to collapse into itself, a funeral pyre of stone and secrets. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hiss of falling snow on hot rubble. Lyra lay in the snow, her head resting on Enzio's chest. The red light on her wrist was fading, the chirping slowing down. She felt so cold. The starlight was finally going out. Enzio, she whispered, I think the rose is tired. Enzio moved then, his hand shaking as he reached out to cup her face. He looked at her, the silver in his eyes bright with tears. No, Lyra, you don't get to stop now. The contracts are burned, the project is gone. We're just us. I know, she breathed, her eyes closing. It's enough. Enzio pulled her into his arms, his warmth the only thing left in the world. He didn't call for Cassian. He didn't look for a car. He just held her in the middle of a snowy street in Bolzano, a tyrant without a crown, holding a girl whose heart was finally, truly free to choose its own end. But then the red light on her wrist didn't go dark. It turned blue, a steady, soft glow. The Starlight Rose monitor, programmed by Greta to detect a total failure, had shifted into a secondary mode, a mode no one had told them about. Stabilized. Lyra's eyes flickered open. She looked at her wrist, then at Enzio. The pain in her chest was gone, replaced by a quiet, rhythmic hum. The project, she whispered, her voice gaining strength. Greta. She said it was a merger. She said the heart and the mind were meant to be one. She reached out, her hand finding the scar on Enzio's chest from the fall. It wasn't just my heart, Enzio. It was yours. Our fathers. They didn't just engineer a cure. They engineered a connection. Enzio looked at the blue light, then at the ruins of the hotel. The truth was finally clear. The Starlight Project hadn't been about immortality. It had been about creating a bond that couldn't be broken by distance, by blood, or by death. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, slow promise in the middle of the alpine night. Then let them come for us, Enzio whispered against her lips, because as long as I can feel your heartbeat, I'll never stop burning their world down. In the distance, the sirens of Bolzano began to wail. But for the first time in 11 years, the Tyrant and his Rose weren't running. They were waiting. Rome was a fever dream of gold, crimson and velvet. The city was in the throes of the carnival, a week where the line between saint and sinner blurred into a kaleidoscope of masks and confetti. The ancient cobblestones of the Via del Corso were hidden beneath a sea of revellers, their laughter echoing off the Pantheon's marble bones. In the shadows of the eternal city, one could become anyone, or disappear entirely. Enzio and Lyra stood on a wrought-iron balcony overlooking the Piazza Navona. The cold, lethal air of Bolzano had been replaced by the scent of roasted chestnuts, incense, and damp stone. Enzio wore a tailored charcoal suit and a mask of a silver lion, regal, scarred, and silent. Lyra was a vision in a gown of shimmering midnight blue, her face hidden behind a delicate porcelain mask of a white swan. The blue light on her wrist monitor was gone, replaced by a simple gold bracelet that Enzio had fashioned to hide the sensors. Her heart beat with a steady, natural rhythm that felt like a miracle. "It's too loud," Enzio said, his eyes scanning the crowd below with the restless intensity of a wolf in a gilded cage. "There are too many masks, too many places for a blade to hide." Lyra stepped closer, resting her hand on his forearm. She could feel the coiled tension in his muscles, the way his body remained a weapon even in a city of celebration. "Relax, Enzio. For the first time in 11 years, the world thinks we are ghosts. Let them celebrate. We've earned one night of being invisible." "We aren't invisible, Lyra," Enzio whispered, his gaze dropping to the black diamond on her finger. "We are just waiting for the next shadow to move." They descended into the piazza, moving through the crowd like two ghosts in a sea of colour. Harlequins danced past them, and the air was thick with the rhythmic beat of tambourines. As they neared the fountain of the Four Rivers, a small child in a tattered cloak darted toward them. He didn't ask for coins. Instead, he pressed a small, wax-sealed envelope into Lyra's hand and vanished into the throng before Cassian, who was trailing them at a distance, could intervene. Lyra stopped, her heart giving a faint thud of adrenaline. She broke the seal. Inside was a single card, thick and cream-coloured, with a scent that made her blood run cold. Jasmine. "The starlight never truly goes out. It only changes its constellation. Join me at the Villa Medici at midnight, or the ghosts of Switzerland will find you first." Lyra's fingers trembled as she handed the card to Enzio. He read it once, his silver eyes narrowing into slits behind the lion mask. "Valia," he hissed. "I thought you killed her in the penthouse." "I hit her with a decanter, Enzio. I saw her bleed," Lyra said, her voice shaking. "But I never saw her die." "And the ghosts of Switzerland." Enzio looked up at the moon hanging over the city. "She's talking about the original lab, the place where my father kept the first 3 subjects." The Villa Medici sat atop the Pincian Hill, a Renaissance fortress overlooking the rooftops of Rome. At midnight, the gardens were a labyrinth of manicured boxwood and marble statues that seemed to watch their every move. Enzio and Lyra moved through the darkness, Cassian trailing 20 paces behind with a suppressed pistol in his hand. The air here was cooler, the scent of jasmine growing stronger with every step. They reached the center of the labyrinth, where a fountain of a weeping angel sat. Standing beside the water was a woman. She was wrapped in a cloak of black feathers, her face hidden behind a mask of a golden serpent. "You came," the woman said. The voice was familiar, but it lacked the sharp, vodka-chilled edge of Valia's. It was softer, older, and filled with a strange, haunting cadence. "Who are you?" Enzio demanded, his hand on the gun at his hip. "Where is Valia?" The woman reached up and slowly removed the serpent mask. Lyra gasped, her hand flying to her chest. It wasn't Valia. The woman looked like an older version of Lyra's own mother, but her eyes were the same silver grey as Enzio's, and across her throat was a jagged, surgical scar. "My name is Bianca," the woman whispered. Enzio's gun clattered to the marble path. He stepped forward, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. "No, Bianca died 11 years ago. I saw the body. I saw the casket." "You saw what Silas wanted you to see, brother," Bianca said, a sad smile touching her lips. "I was the first success. But I was too valuable to be a daughter. I was moved to Switzerland to be the prototype. I've lived in a glass room for a decade, watching you through a screen." Bianca walked toward them, her movements fluid but fragile. She stopped in front of Enzio, her hand reaching out to touch the lion mask. "You saved her," Bianca said, looking at Lyra. "You broke the cycle Silas started, but you didn't end it. Valia didn't send that note. She's dead, killed by the Volkov remnants for her failure. The note came from the board, the Valerius investors who still hold the keys to the Swiss vault." Lyra stepped forward, her heart beating fast. "What do they want from us?" "They don't want you anymore, Lyra," Bianca said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "The enzyme is obsolete. They found something better in the ashes of Bolzano. They found the resonance between your heart and Enzio's." Bianca reached into her cloak and pulled out a small, portable tablet. She swiped the screen, revealing a series of blueprints, not of a heart, but of a transmission network. "They aren't trying to heal people anymore," Bianca said. "They are trying to synchronize them, a way to control the neural rhythms of an entire population through the same biological connection you and Enzio share. They call it the Starlight Requiem." Suddenly, a red dot appeared on Bianca's chest. "Get down!" Enzio roared. He tackled Lyra to the ground just as a sniper's bullet whistled through the air, impacting the marble fountain behind them. Bianca didn't move. She stood by the weeping angel, looking up at the moon with a strange, peaceful expression. "Go to the Vatican," Bianca said, the blood beginning to bloom across her black feathers. "The archives. The Sano name isn't just a family, Lyra. It's a key. The original formula. It wasn't science. It was something else." A second shot rang out. Bianca collapsed into the fountain, her silver eyes finally finding peace as the water turned crimson. The gardens of the Villa Medici erupted into a war zone. Tactical teams in black silk masks, the Valerius board's private security, descended from the walls. "Cassian, the North Gate!" Enzio yelled, pulling Lyra into the cover of the boxwood hedges. "We have to get to her," Lyra cried, looking back at the fountain. "She's gone, Lyra," Enzio growled, his eyes fierce with a new kind of rage. "She gave us the map. We finished this for her." They ran through the labyrinth, bullets chipping away at the marble statues. They reached the exit just as a black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. Cassian was at the wheel, his face a mask of iron. As they tore away from the Villa Medici, Lyra looked back at the city. The fireworks of the Carnival were exploding over the Colosseum. Bursts of gold, green, and red. To the world, it was a celebration. To Lyra, it looked like the world was on fire. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the gold bracelet Enzio had given her. She felt the pulse in her wrist, steady, strong, and now connected to something far bigger than a Mafia debt. "The Vatican," Lyra said, her voice hardening. "My mother's journals. She mentioned a Sano chapel beneath the archives. She said it was where the stars were kept." Enzio looked at her, his silver eyes reflecting the fire of the city. "Then we go to the heart of the church," he said, his hand finding hers, "and we show them that some stars are meant to be wild." The tyrant and his rose were no longer just running for their lives. They were moving toward the center of the world, ready to uncover a secret that would burn the house of Valerius to the ground once and for all. The Vatican, at 3 in the morning, was a fortress of silent stone and holy secrets. The humid breath of the Tiber River clung to the massive walls of the Leonine city, and the cobblestones of St. Peter's Square felt like the teeth of an ancient sleeping beast. Enzio, Lyra, and Cassian moved through the shadows of the Bernini colonnade. They had shed their carnival finery for the dark, utilitarian gear of shadows. Enzio carried the weight of his sister's death in the rigid set of his shoulders, his silver eyes fixed on the bronze doors of the secret archives. Bianca said the Sano name was a key, Lyra whispered, her hand instinctively pressing against the gold bracelet on her wrist. The rhythmic throb of her heart felt different here, deeper, as if it were resonating with the very foundations of the city. My mother used to tell me that our ancestors weren't just merchants. They were guardians of the light. Enzio stopped at a side entrance, a heavy wooden door marked only with a faded cross. He pulled out a specialized electronic override, but as he reached for the lock, the door groaned and swung inward. It was already open. "Someone's expecting us," Cassian grunted, his submachine gun raised. "Or they're already inside." They descended into the belly of the Vatican, past rows of shelving that held centuries of forbidden knowledge. The air was cool, smelling of parchment, beeswax, and a faint, metallic tang that made Lyra's heart skip. They reached the lower levels where the stone turned from marble to rough-hewn volcanic tuff. Here the Christian icons faded, replaced by older, stranger symbols, constellations carved into the arches, and eyes that seemed to track their movement. In a hidden chamber beneath the main archive, they found it, the Sano Chapel. It was a small, circular room. In the center sat an altar of black obsidian, and atop it was a chest of tarnished silver. But it wasn't the chest that drew Lyra's attention. It was the mural on the ceiling. It depicted a fall of stars into a Mediterranean cove, the very cove beneath the Villa Valerius in Sicily. The stars weren't just light, they were liquid, being gathered by men in robes into vials. "The Starlight Project isn't science, Enzio," Lyra whispered, stepping toward the altar. "It's alchemy. My ancestors found something in that cove centuries ago, something that shouldn't belong to this world." Enzio approached the chest. He reached out, his hand hovering over the silver lid. "My father didn't discover a cure. He rediscovered a parasite." He opened the chest. Inside was a single journal, bound in human leather, and a vial of liquid so bright it made the shadows in the room retreat. It was the original Starlight essence, pure, undiluted, and terrifying. "I'll take that, Enzio." The voice didn't come from the doorway. It came from behind them. They spun around. Cassian was standing 5 paces back, his gun leveled not at the door, but at Enzio's head. His scarred face was a mask of weary regret. "Cassian?" Enzio's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "What are you doing?" "The board made me an offer years ago, boss," Cassian said, his finger steady on the trigger. "Before the gala, before Sicily. They knew Silas was losing his mind, and they needed someone to ensure the reserves were protected. I was the one who told Valia about the 9-minute gap in Sicily. I was the one who ensured the Volkovs found the orchard." Lyra felt the world tilt. The man who had bled for them, who had saved them a dozen times, he was the leak. He was the serpent in their garden. "Why?" Lyra cried. "We trusted you." "Trust is for people who don't have families to protect, miss," Cassian said. "The board has my daughter. They've had her since she was 6. Every time I helped you, I bought her another year of life. But now they want the origin. They want the Saint of Shadows." He gestured to the vial on the altar. "That liquid, it isn't just an enzyme. It's a biological tether. Whoever drinks it becomes the saint, a living battery for the requiem network. Silas wanted it for Bianca. Then he wanted it for Lyra. But the board? They want it for the world? Suddenly, the chapel doors burst open. Tactical teams in the white masks of the Valerius board flooded the room, their red laser sights dancing across the obsidian altar. At their head stood a man Lyra had never seen, a man with white hair and eyes like dead glass. The chairman. "Thank you, Cassian," the chairman said, his voice a dry whisper. "Your debt is settled. You may go to your daughter." Cassian lowered his gun, his eyes not meeting Enzio's. He started to walk toward the exit, but the chairman raised a hand. A muffled pop echoed in the small chamber. Cassian gasped, a red flower blooming on his chest. He fell to his knees, looking at Enzio with an expression of profound apology before collapsing onto the cold stone. "No!" Lyra screamed, but Enzio grabbed her, pulling her behind the altar as the tactical team opened fire. "The saint must be pure!" the chairman roared over the din of gunfire. "Grab the girl! Kill the tyrant!" Enzio looked at the vial on the altar. He looked at Lyra, her blue eyes wide with terror and a dawning, terrible realization. If the board took the vial, the world would become a cage. If they took her, she would become a machine. "Lyra," Enzio said, his voice calm amidst the storm of bullets. "Do you trust me?" "With my life," she whispered. Enzio grabbed the obsidian vial. He didn't give it to the chairman. He didn't hide it. He uncorked it and drank the liquid in one jagged swallow. The effect was instantaneous. Enzio's silver eyes turned a blinding bioluminescent blue. The veins in his neck stood out like glowing wires. He let out a roar that wasn't human, a sound that shook the very foundations of the Vatican. The tactical teams froze. The red lasers wavered. Enzio stood up, the light radiating from his skin so bright it blinded the white-masked men. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a storm. He was the saint of shadows. "You wanted the requiem?" Enzio's voice was a thunderous resonance that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Then listen to the song of the dead." He stepped forward, and the air in the chapel began to hum with a lethal frequency. The white-masked men fell to their knees, clutching their heads as their own heartbeats synchronized with Enzio's, and then, with a terrifying snap, stopped. One by one, the board soldiers collapsed. The chairman stared in horror as his own hand began to tremble, his heart slowing to a crawl. You've ruined it," the chairman wheezed. "You weren't the match. It will kill you." "I know," Enzio said, the blue light beginning to fade, his body trembling under the weight of the power. He turned to Lyra. The light was dying, and he was falling. She caught him, her hands cold against his burning skin. Enzio, look at me." "The journals," he panted, his eyes returning to their silver grey. "The back page, the counter-frequency. Use the Sano blood, Lyra. End it." His eyes closed. Lyra looked at the fallen Cassian, at the dead chairman, and at the man who had turned himself into a weapon to save her one last time. She reached for the leather-bound journal on the altar. She didn't cry. The Starlight Rose was gone. The queen of the House of Valerius stood up, the vial empty, the secret revealed. "I'm going to end it, Enzio," she whispered to the shadows. "I'm going to burn the stars out of the sky." The Alps of Switzerland were not like the jagged, emotional peaks of the Dolomites. They were cold, clinical, and precise. A landscape of white silence that mirrored the high-tech sterility of the Valerius board's secret heart. The cradle was a subterranean facility carved into a glacier near St. Moritz. It was the birthplace of the Starlight Project and the intended throne for the Requiem network. Lyra stood at the edge of the helipad, the wind whipping her black tactical coat around her legs. She looked like a shadow against the blinding snow. She was alone. Cassian was dead in the Roman dust, and Enzio was in a medically stabilized coma in a safe house beneath the Tiber, his body a battlefield for the alchemical poison he had swallowed to save her. She touched the gold bracelet on her wrist. It was no longer a monitor, it was a transmitter. Inside its casing lay the counter-frequency she had decoded from her mother's journal in the Sano chapel. "Mrs. Valerius," a voice came over the facility's intercom, echoing off the ice walls. "We didn't think you would have the courage to come, or the foolishness." "I'm not here as a guest," Lyra said, her voice amplified by the headset she wore. "I'm here as the auditor, and the House of Valerius is bankrupt." Lyra entered the facility. It was a cathedral of glass and steel, filled with rows of humming servers and white-coated technicians who moved like ghosts. In the center of the main hall, a massive holographic sphere projected a map of the world, thousands of red points flickering like a slow-burning fever. The requiem. Standing at the base of the sphere was the vice-chairman, a woman named Sicily, who had taken control after the chairman's death in Rome. She was elegant, bloodless, and held a tablet that controlled the very air in the room. "You brought the journal, I assume?" Selena asked, her eyes fixed on the leather-bound book tucked into Lyra's belt. "The final synthesis for the saint's stability." "Enzio is dying, Lyra. His heart is vibrating at a frequency the human body can't sustain. Only the data in that book can save him." Lyra walked toward her, her footsteps echoing on the glass floor. Beneath the glass she could see the massive cooling fans of the server farm. "He didn't drink the vial to be stable, Selene. He drank it to show you that your Starlight is just a slow-acting poison." "It's evolution," Selene retorted. "With the requiem, we can end war. We can synchronize the world's empathy. No more conflict, no more chaos. Just one perfect, rhythmic peace." "The peace of the grave," Lyra said. She reached the holographic sphere. The red dots were beginning to pulse in unison. The synchronization had begun. Somewhere in Rome, Enzio's heart would be matching this rhythm, tearing itself apart. "Give me the journal, Lyra," Selene commanded. Two guards stepped out from behind the servers, their rifles leveled at Lyra's head. "Save your husband. Let us finish the work." Lyra looked at the map. She thought of Bianca, trapped in a glass room for a decade. She thought of her mother, dying in a Tuscan field, and she thought of the teenage boy who had jumped into the black water 11 years ago. "My mother's journal didn't have a synthesis for stability," Lyra said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "It had a recipe for a virus. The Sano blood isn't the fuel for the Starlight, Selene. It's the corrosive." Lyra didn't hand over the journal. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small lancet. She sliced her palm, the blood bright and crimson against her pale skin. She slammed her bleeding hand onto the biometric scanner at the base of the holographic sphere. "What are you doing?" Selene shrieked, tapping frantically at her tablet. "Override! Access denied!" "The Sano name is the key," Lyra whispered, "and the key is made of blood." The gold bracelet on her wrist began to glow, not blue, but a fierce, angry violet. The counter-frequency Lyra had uploaded into the bracelet began to transmit, fueled by the biological resonance of her own heart. The holographic sphere flickered. The red dots on the map turned violet, then began to wink out, one by one. The servers beneath the floor groaned, the sound of 1,000 machines beginning to overheat. "You're destroying it," Selene screamed, lunging for Lyra. "You're killing us all." "I'm waking the world up," Lyra said. The facility erupted into chaos. The cooling fans beneath the floor exploded, sending shards of glass and plumes of freezing nitrogen into the air. The technicians fled for the exits, but the doors were already locking down. The virus was spreading through every Valerius system on the planet. Lyra stood her ground, the violet light from her wrist illuminating her face like an avenging angel. She felt her heart skip, the strain of the transmission tearing at her valves. She didn't care. For every red dot that vanished on the map, she felt Enzio's pulse in Rome grow stronger, steadier. She was the bridge. She was the anchor. Celine tried to reach the manual override, but a blast from a bursting nitrogen pipe sent her flying across the room. The vice-chairman hit the glass wall and slumped to the floor, her vision filled with the ruin of her perfect peace. Lyra collapsed to her knees, her vision blurring. The holographic sphere was dark now. The requiem was silent. The Starlight project was finally, truly dead. She reached for the headset. "Enzio, can you hear me?" Silence. "Enzio, please." Across the thousands of miles, through the static of a dying network, a sound came through. A heartbeat, steady, natural, silver grey. "I'm here, Starlight," a voice rasped, weak but unmistakable. "I'm here." Lyra let out a sob, her head falling against the cold metal of the console. The cradle was collapsing around her, the ice of the glacier beginning to reclaim the stone. But for the first time in her life, the future didn't feel like a contract. It felt like a breath. The extraction team Enzio had sent weeks ago, loyalists who hadn't been touched by the board's corruption, found Lyra in the wreckage an hour later. They carried her out into the crisp, alpine dawn. The sun was rising over the peaks, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. Lyra sat on the edge of the transport helicopter, her hand bandaged, her heart beating with a quiet, stubborn strength. She looked down at the black diamond ring on her finger. She took it off. She looked at the diamond for a long moment, then flicked her wrist. The ring fell, a tiny black speck disappearing into the vast white abyss of the Swiss Alps. She didn't need the ring to know who she was. She wasn't a debt. She wasn't an investment. She was Lyra Di Sano Valerius, the woman who had walked through the fire and come out holding the sun. "Take me home," she told the pilot. "I have a husband to wake up." The aftermath of a fallen empire is never quiet. It is a discordant symphony of sirens, shredders, and the frantic whispers of those left in the wreckage. Across the globe, the Valerius board's influence evaporated. From the shipping lanes of Singapore to the pharmaceutical labs of Zurich, the Starlight Requiem virus had done its work. The digital tethers were snapped, the illicit patents were purged, and the men who had sought to own the world's heartbeat were now fleeing into the shadows of extradition treaties. New York, however, remained the center of the storm. Lyra sat in the sun-drenched library of the Valerius Heights estate. The house no longer felt like a gilded cage. The guards had been replaced by a small, hand-picked security detail of men who had fought alongside Enzio, not for his money, but for the man himself. Across the room, Enzio stood by the fireplace. He looked thinner, the lines around his eyes deeper, but the blue luminescence was gone from his gaze. His eyes were silver once more, though they held a weariness that went down to the marrow. He was a king who had burned his own throne to save his queen. "The lawyers say the Disano Plaza is being auctioned off by the feds," Lyra said, closing the leather-bound ledger on her lap. "And my father, his heart gave out in the holding cell this morning." Enzio didn't turn. He watched the flames, his hand resting on the mantle. "Lorenzo died the moment he signed that contract 11 years ago, Lyra. He just took a long time to realize it." "And the Valerius name?" Lyra asked. "The press is calling it the greatest corporate collapse in history." "Let them," Enzio said, finally turning to face her. "The name was a brand Silas used to mark his property. I'm fine with it being ash. The piece was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar face. Dr. Aris, the cardiologist who had once been a pawn of the Starlight project, entered the room. He looked shaken, clutching a small vintage lockbox made of tarnished silver. Mr. Valerius, Mrs. Valerius, Aris said, bowing slightly. I was clearing out the sub-basement of the Zurich lab before the authorities arrived. I found this in Silas's private safe. It wasn't part of the digital network. It's the original bequest. Enzio's expression hardened. I told you to burn everything, Aris. I tried, Aris whispered. But the lock, it's biometric. It requires a specific resonance, one that only occurs when two people with the Starlight history are in the same room. The box began to hum, a low, rhythmic vibration that matched the pulse in Lyra's wrist and the steady beat in Enzio's chest. The Starlight was gone, but the connection was permanent. Lyra stood up and walked toward the box. Enzio joined her. They placed their hands on the lid together. The lock clicked. Inside the box was not a vial or a blueprint. It was a single, old-fashioned wax cylinder and a handwritten letter. Enzio opened the letter. The handwriting was Silas Valerius's, sharp, arrogant, and filled with a terrifying conviction. To my son, and the girl who stole his focus. If you are reading this, it means you have succeeded in destroying my work. You have chosen the wild heart over the engineered one. You think you have won. But I knew you better than you knew yourself, Enzio. You were always a boy who loved to save things. The letter continued, each word a psychological needle. The connection you feel isn't just the enzyme, and it isn't just a frequency. It's a failsafe. I engineered the Starlight so that as long as one of you lives, the other can never truly be free. Your heartbeats are entwined, yes, but so are your shadows. If you ever try to leave each other, the dissonance will kill you both within a year. You were never meant to be partners, Enzio. You were meant to be each other's life support. You didn't escape the cage, you became it. Lyra felt the air grow cold, the wild heartbeat she thought she had reclaimed. It was still a tether. Even in victory, Silas had managed to turn their love into a survival mechanic. He's lying, Lyra whispered, her hand trembling. He has to be. Enzio took the wax cylinder and placed it on an old phonograph in the corner. The needle scratched, and then the voice of Silas Valerius filled the room, cold, hollow, and triumphant. He spoke of the biological synchronization, of the sovereign dawn, where two souls would be forced to breathe as one. Enzio watched the cylinder spin. He looked at Lyra, who was standing in the center of the room, her hand over her heart. He saw the doubt in her eyes, the fear that their entire relationship was just a high-stakes biological trap. Enzio stepped forward. He didn't look at the box or the letter. He grabbed the wax cylinder and smashed it against the stone hearth. Then he tossed the letter into the fire. "Enzio!" Lyra cried. "I don't care if he was lying or telling the truth," Enzio said, his voice a low, lethal roar. "I don't care if my heart beats because of a lab or because of you. I chose you 11 years ago when I jumped into that water. I chose you at the Pierre. I chose you in Sicily." He took her hands, pulling her flush against him. Silas wanted to own us. He wanted to turn our lives into a series of managed dependencies. But he forgot one thing about the House of Valerius. Enzio leaned down, his silver eyes burning with a fierce, independent fire. "We don't follow the blueprints, we rewrite them." Lyra looked into his eyes and felt the steady, rhythmic thrum of their connection. It wasn't a cage, it was a foundation. If Silas had engineered them to be inseparable, he had accidentally given them the one thing a Mafia life usually lacked: a permanent, unbreakable loyalty. He wanted us to be a machine, Lyra whispered, her fear beginning to transform into a cold, hard resolve. But we're a storm. Exactly, Enzio breathed. He kissed her then, a kiss that wasn't about protection or possession, but about a sovereign alliance. They were the last of their bloodlines, the survivors of a dark age of alchemy and greed. The sun began to set over New York, casting long golden shadows across the library. The sovereign dawn their fathers had imagined was dead. In its place was something much more dangerous. Two people who had nothing left to lose and an entire world to rebuild in their own image. That night, Enzio stood on the balcony of the estate. Cassian was gone, but a new man stood in his place. A young soldier named Dante, whose loyalty had been forged in the fire of Bolzano. "The ports are clear, boss," Dante reported. "The Volkov remnants have retreated to Moscow. The board's assets have been liquidated. We're clean." "Good," Enzio said. "From now on, we don't trade in blood. We trade in information, and we ensure that no one ever tries to start a project like this again." Lyra stepped onto the balcony beside him. She was wearing a dress of simple white silk, her starlight necklace gone, her heart beating a quiet, powerful rhythm. "What now, Enzio?" she asked. Enzio looked out at the city lights. "Now, we live, and we make sure the world knows that the House of Valerius isn't just a name anymore." He put his arm around her, and the two of them stood there, the tyrant and his rose, the saint and the heir, watching the city they had saved and the future they had finally earned. The silent vow was broken. The world was loud, chaotic, and beautiful. And for the first time in their lives, they were ready to hear it. The passage of a year had turned the blood-soaked legends of the Valerius Di Sano War into whispers among the elite. The Starlight Project was now a dark myth, a cautionary tale buried under layers of legal settlements and charred ruins. New York had a new rhythm, and at its center sat a power couple that no longer operated from the shadows of fear, but from the height of an hard-won sovereignty. The Villa Valerius in Sicily had been rebuilt, not as a fortress, but as a sanctuary. On this midsummer night, the air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the salt of the Mediterranean. Lyra stood on the terrace where Enzio had once told her she was a liability. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue that mirrored the Sicilian sky, the fabric shimmering with thousands of tiny hand-sewn crystals. She looked like a Chom Sao constellation brought to life. Her heart, once the focal point of a global conspiracy, beat with a quiet, forgotten regularity. "The gala is waiting, Mrs. Valerius." Enzio stepped onto the terrace. He looked impeccable in a black tuxedo, his silver hair catching the moonlight. The scars on his face had faded into fine lines of character, and the coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, immovable peace. He walked to her, his hand sliding around her waist, his thumb tracing the gold band on her finger. "Let them wait," Lyra whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I was just thinking about the black water. 11 years. It feels like a lifetime ago." "It was," Enzio said. "The boy who jumped in is gone, and the girl he saved. She's the one who saved him in the end." The peace was broken by the sound of a single, rhythmic chime from Enzio's breast pocket. It was a frequency he hadn't heard in 12 months, the emergency signal from the Zurich vaults. They both went still. The connection they shared, the biological tether Silas had engineered, hummed with a sudden, sharp dissonance. "Someone is in the remains of the lab," Enzio hissed, his hand going to the small of his back where a concealed weapon always rested. "It's impossible," Lyra said. "The glacier reclaimed it." They didn't call the guards. They didn't wait. They moved through the villa to the private communications hub. On the screen, a grainy, low-light feed flickered to life. It wasn't a tactical team or a Volkov survivor. It was a young girl, perhaps 8 years old. She was sitting in the wreckage of the cradle, clutching a worn teddy bear. Her eyes were wide, and in the darkness of the ruined lab, they glowed with a faint, bioluminescent blue. Subject L04. The fourth girl. The one Silas had hidden even from Greta. "She's the last of the Starlight," Lyra whispered, her heart aching with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. She was the fail-safe. If we destroyed the network, she was meant to be the reboot. "We have to go to her," Enzio said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "If the board's creditors find out she exists, the hunt starts all over again." "No," Lyra said, turning to him. "If we go to her as Valerius and Disano, we bring the fire with us. We have to do something else." They looked at each other, the unspoken understanding between them absolute. They were the only ones who knew the frequency. They were the only ones who could bridge the gap between the science and the soul. A week later, a small, unmarked boat slipped into the cove beneath the villa. A young girl stepped onto the sand, her blue eyes fading to a natural brown, as she breathed in the salt air of Sicily. Enzio and Lyra were waiting for her. They didn't take her to a lab. They didn't run tests. They took her to the orchards where the lemons hung like gold in the sun. They gave her a name, Sophia, and a life that had no contracts, no patents, and no debts. As the sun set over the Mediterranean, Lyra sat on the stone wall with Sophia, showing her how to track the Comsao, constellations, in the sky. Enzio stood a few paces back, watching them both. The Starlight requiem was truly over. The connection between Enzio and Lyra remained, but it was no longer a cage. It was the gravity that held their world together. They weren't just the survivors of a Mafia war. They were the guardians of a secret that would never be told. "Look, Sophia," Lyra said, pointing to a cluster of bright stars. "That one is Lyra. It's a harp. It plays the music of the world." "And those two?" the girl asked, pointing to a pair of stars that sat exceptionally close together, pulsing in perfect unison. Lyra looked at Enzio. He smiled, the dimple in his cheek appearing, the rare specific thing that was hers alone. "Those," Lyra whispered, "are the guardians. They make sure the harp never stops playing." The Tyrant and his rose had found their peace. The silent vow was kept, not in blood or ink, but in every breath they took together. The House of Valerius was no longer an empire of shadows. It was a home. And as the stars came out over Sicily, the world went on, loud, chaotic, and finally, beautifully free. 10 years after the explosion in the Swiss glaciers and the total collapse of the Starlight project, the New York underworld no longer spoke of the Valerius name with pure terror, but with a distant, profound respect. The empire of blood and tears had been replaced by the Starlight Foundation, a medical advocacy and child protection organization dedicated to wiping out the remnants of illegal biological experiments across the globe. In far-off Sicily, the afternoon sun stained the jagged limestone cliffs, a deep gold. Enzio Valerius had entered middle age, but time had only added to the rugged majesty of a king who had abdicated his throne. He stood by the window of his study, looking down at the shoreline where a small wooden boat bobbed on the waves. The scars on his hands had faded, but the Valerius signet ring remained, no longer a symbol of possession, but a testament to a lifelong vow of protection. "Enzio, you're lost in thought again." Lyra entered, her white silk dress fluttering softly in the sea breeze. In her 30s, she possessed the mature, radiant beauty of a woman who was completely and utterly loved. Her heart, a miracle of nature and devotion, beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. She no longer needed chemical compounds. Enzio's very breath was her best medicine. He turned, drawing her into a firm embrace. "I was just thinking, if I hadn't jumped into that black water 11 years ago, would destiny have found another way to bring you to me?" Lyra smiled, pressing her ear against the chest of the man who had burned the world for her, listening to his calm, steady heartbeat. "Destiny doesn't matter, Enzio. What matters is that you chose me, time and time again." Suddenly, the sound of bright laughter drifted up from the orange groves. Two children, a boy and a girl, were chasing a shepherd dog. The older boy had his father's sharp, silver-grey eyes, while the little girl inherited her mother's elegance and soft, wavy hair. They were pure children. Enzio and Lyra had sworn never to let their offspring be touched by the chemical madness of the previous generation. They were born of love, not a laboratory. "Papa, Mama, look, the first star is out." The little girl pointed toward the horizon, where the constellation Lyra began to shimmer against the falling night. Enzio took Lyra's hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. In that moment, the biological connection their fathers had engineered had truly vanished, replaced by a deep soul bond that no technology could ever replicate. They were no longer debtor and collector. They were no longer hostage and captor. They were simply Enzio and Lyra, two shattered lives that had pieced themselves together into a perfect masterpiece. The Sicilian night fell, peaceful and free. There, the starlight was no longer a dark project, but a guiding light for those who had found each other amidst gunfire and hatred. A story that began with bullets had finally closed with the rhythmic sound of waves and the laughter of children.